Thank you, Mr. Rothstein. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
Yes, thank you. And my name is Richard.
Richard, all right. I was raised to respect my elders, sir.
Well, that's okay. I feel respected.
Yes, yes. That was an excellent film. Thank you so much for that. I want to go ahead and also thank everyone that hung in there for this session. We asked for your patience. You've given us that. And so Richard has been really patient with us as well. We had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Rothstein today. He's an author and historian from the Economic Policy Institute. He's an American historian and academic. His research focuses on the history of segregation in the United States with regards to education and housing. He's a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Previously, he was a national education columnist for the New York Times from 1999 to 2002. He's the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogenous neighborhoods and patterns that violate the Constitution and require remediation. He is also the author of many, many other articles and books on race and education. Richard, it's a pleasure to meet you again, and we look forward to listening to everything that you have to share with us today. How are you today?
I am fine, thank you. Thanks very much, Julian. I know we're running a little bit late, so I'll be a little bit briefer than I had planned, but I think I can cover everything. As you all know, we had the civil rights movement in the 20th century. It challenged segregation in colleges and universities, then in Brown versus Board of Education, in legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then the Brown decision gave impetus and inspiration to a new civil rights movement that over the course of the next 15 years, really, through marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience, people lost their lives. But over the course of the next 15 years, we abolished segregation in public accommodations, in lunch counters, buses. You know this history, I assume. But it left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Everyone that I've lived in had areas that were all white or mostly white, areas that were all African-American or mostly African-American. We came to understand as a country, mostly, that racial segregation was wrong. It was immoral. It was harmful to both blacks and to whites. It was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How is it that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? I think in one sense you can understand it. It's a lot harder to undo residential segregation than to undo segregation in lunch counters or buses or water fountains. You pass a law saying that from now on you can't segregate buses, and the next day you sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if you pass a law saying that we can't segregate neighborhoods, the next day things don't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, every one of us, and I'm talking about blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Westerners, Easterners, was we've adopted a national rationalization for failing to continue the civil rights movement to end the segregation of neighborhoods. And that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of buses and lunch counters and water fountains and schools and colleges, that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation, a civil rights violation. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation, also a civil rights violation. And most of us understand that as Americans, if there's a civil rights violation, we're obligated to remedy it. We're obligated to do something about it. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, oh, that's something entirely different. We say that residential segregation happened because people like to live with each other of the same race, or maybe private homeowners or landlords bigoted, refused to rent or sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe businesses in the private economy, real estate agencies and banks discriminated, or maybe we say it's all a result of income differences. All of these individual, personal, bigoted decisions, we say, is what's created residential segregation. It wasn't government. We give a name to this rationalization. We say, and we all use this term, we say we have de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact. Well, as Julian described, I used to be an education writer. That was mostly what I was concerned about. And I came to understand that the achievement gap between Black and white children was not the result of low teacher expectations or poor schools primarily. Of course, there are some teachers who have low expectations of African-American children, but that's not the reason we have an achievement gap, why on average, Black children achieve at lower levels than white children. The main reason for it is that so many African-American children come to school with social and economic disadvantages that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for schools to overcome those disadvantages and teach. So, for example, I remember one column I wrote many years ago about asthma. As you may know, in Black neighborhoods, African-American children in low-income neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children, 4 times the rate. They have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely, not necessarily, but more likely than a child without asthma to be up at night wheezing. And the child is more likely, not always, but more likely to come to school drowsy the next day. And I tried to explain if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, same income levels, but one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group was going to have lower average achievement, no matter how high the teacher expectations were, no matter how often the children were tested. And then I began to realize it wasn't just asthma, but it was asthma, it was lead poisoning, it was homelessness, it was economic insecurity. When you add all these things up, you've explained the achievement gap. And what's more, when you have schools which concentrate children, where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or some other combination of these, it's impossible for such a school to achieve at the level of schools where children come to school healthy and well-rested and well-nourished and in secure economic environments. Well, we call schools like that segregated schools. And the reality is the schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 50 years, more segregated. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, as an education writer, I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated the programs of 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, that attempted in a very trivial way to integrate the schools, to desegregate the schools. They gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend within the district. But if the choice was going to exacerbate segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would not exacerbate segregation. So if you had a school that was all white or mostly white, you had one place left and both a Black and a white child applied for that last remaining place, the Black child would give it some preference because it wouldn't exacerbate segregation. Well, the Supreme Court evaluated this program. It denounced it. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion. He said you couldn't do such a thing. He explained that the reason that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that. And then he went on to say that the reason that these neighborhoods were segregated was the de facto reasons I talked about before: private bigotry, self-choice, economic differences, and so on. And he said, we have de facto segregation, not created by government. It's actually a violation of the Constitution for government to do anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the 2 districts that was involved. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. He had an African-American friend living in the center city. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner, his friend, bought a second home in this suburb of Shively, this all-white suburb of Shively, and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, with his wife and daughter. An angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop them. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop them. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the courts are enforcing racial boundaries in Louisville, it's a 14th Amendment violation. It's a civil rights violation. And I looked into it further and I found, and I'm not exaggerating, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases in the mid-20th century, not just in border states like Louisville, but in New York and Chicago and Detroit and Washington, in Los Angeles and San Francisco, where police protected, sometimes police directed violence drove African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in previously all white neighborhoods. Every one of these was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, where the police were involved in instigating or protecting violence against African American residents. And then when I looked into it further, I found there were many, many state, federal, and local policies that were designed on an explicitly racial basis to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area in this country. You saw summarized in the video you just watched one of them. I'll summarize it very, very briefly again. In the mid-20th century, the federal government decided on a racially explicit basis to move all white families, white working class families, out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. The most famous of these is Levittown, east of New York City. Perhaps you know it, but they're all over the country, south of San Francisco, Westlake, south of Los Angeles, Lakewood, many, many of these suburbs in every metropolitan area, some not as large, and many not as large as Levittown. Levittown was 17,000 homes in one place, incredibly large subdivision. William Levitt, the builder, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land and build the homes for 17,000 buyers that he hadn't yet identified. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do that. The only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting his plans for the development, including a commitment that he would never sell a home to an African American. And in addition, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration required him to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans and rental to African Americans. And they did this all over the country. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the federal government. It was a written requirement of the policy manual of the Federal Housing Administration. It was called the underwriting manual. It was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend applications of builders for federal bank guarantees for their loans. The federal written policy manual said you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a bank guarantee a developer who was going to build an all-white subdivision if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. This was federal policy that created a white noose around every metropolitan area in this country. Well, in the mid-20th century, when these subdivisions were built with federal guarantees on a racially explicit basis, they were inexpensive. They were for working class families. Levittown, for example, or Westlake south of San Francisco, they sold at that time for about, in today's money, about $100,000. Any returning war veteran who had a job in the post-war economy, black or white, could have afforded to buy such a home. In fact, the returning veterans, required no down payment, were required to have no down payment by the Veterans Administration. They could pay less, and I'll come to this a bit later, they could pay less in their housing in suburbs like this than they had been paying for rent in public housing previously. On this basis, white noose, as I say, was created around every metropolitan area. In 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act. it said, okay, African Americans, you can now move to these suburbs that we've previously prohibited you from living in. But in the meantime, the value of homes in these subdivisions increased. The property values increased. White families living in these homes gained equity, wealth, from the appreciation and the value of their homes. You can't buy a home in Levittown or Westlake or any of these other places today for $100,000. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in some parts of the country, $1 million. White families who bought these homes with a racial guarantee by the federal government used the wealth that they gained from the appreciation and the value of their homes to send their children to college. They used it to finance emergencies, perhaps temporary unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth generating exercise. The result is that today, while African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. You would think if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. But that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. It was a civil rights violation that exists, that persists to this day because of the wealth gap it created, and that we, all of us as Americans, white and black, have an obligation to remedy. Well, there were many, many other policies that the federal, state, and local governments followed to create segregation. I'll mention one other, and then I'd love to take questions if you have them. Public housing, something we misunderstand. Public housing was not created for poor people. The first civilian public housing in this country was created in the 1930s during the Depression and the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration. Poor people weren't permitted into public housing. It wasn't subsidized. Families had to pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. We had an enormous unemployment problem in the Depression. 25% of the workforce was unemployed, comparable to what we have today, even more so. But 75% of the workforce was working with good jobs, getting regular incomes. Those are the ones for whom public housing was designed. It was the most desirable housing available. These were families that could afford housing because they had steady incomes, but for whom no housing was available because the Depression, nothing was being built. There was a housing shortage. The federal government built the first civilian housing in this public housing in this country during this period, and everywhere it segregated it, creating separate projects for African Americans and for whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and that may surprise you. But in the mid-20th century, early 20th century, we had many integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas in this country. I'm not saying that every other house was a different race, but the neighborhoods were broadly integrated. The reason was we were a manufacturing economy. None of this internet stuff. We were making things, and factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals, so the factories were concentrated in a central district. And if you had a factory that was employing both black and white workers, they had to live in broadly the same neighborhood so they could walk to work. They didn't have automobiles. Well, the Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, went into these neighborhoods in many cases and created separate projects for African Americans and whites, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Some of you may be familiar with I'm sure you all are, or most of you are, the great African American novelist, playwright, poet, Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes wrote in his autobiography that he grew up in a downtown integrated Cleveland neighborhood. That's not the way we think of Cleveland today, downtown Cleveland today. He says his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. That's what you'd expect to be going on in an integrated neighborhood with an integrated high school. But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in that area of Cleveland and elsewhere in Cleveland with other projects that persists to this day. In my book, The Color of Law, I like where I can to speak of self-satisfied smug places, thinks they're better than everybody else. One of them you may be familiar with is Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT. called the Central Square neighborhood. In the 1930s, was a fully integrated neighborhood. It's about half white, half black. Public Works Administration demolished housing in that community of the Central Square neighborhood of Cambridge, built a separate project for blacks. They built a separate project for whites as well, creating a pattern of segregation in the Central Square neighborhood that otherwise would never have existed. And with that and other projects elsewhere in the Boston area, created and sustained the segregation that we know today. During World War II, the policy accentuated. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers, black and white, flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries that hadn't previously existed. The West Coast is a good example because for those of you who know your history of the great migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country, know that there was no significant migration of black families out of the South into the West Coast until World War II. That's when it began. So there was no previous pattern of segregation that existed on the West Coast. But the federal government had to build housing for the war workers who were coming, working mostly in shipyards and aircraft carriers, and it did. It built segregated housing for workers who were working in the same war plants, separate projects for war workers who were black, separate projects for war workers who were white, creating segregation where it hadn't previously been known on the West Coast. In San Francisco, they built 5 projects. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans. It was placed in an area called the Fillmore District, which then became the African American neighborhood of San Francisco. This went on all over the country. Well, there were many, many other federal, state, and local policies that government followed on a racially explicit basis to create segregation in this country. The notion of de facto segregation is an utter myth. There's no reality to it whatsoever. The boundaries of the racial boundaries in our cities all across the country, our metropolitan areas all across the country, are a civil rights violation. We have an obligation to remedy it as American citizens. We have an obligation to remedy civil rights violations. It's going to be difficult. There are many, many policies we can follow to do so. Policy ideas are not hard to find. Housing experts know what we could do to redress segregation. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to demand, insist upon, make it uncomfortable to maintain segregated boundaries in this country. I can mention a few examples of those policies, but there are many, many others that we can follow and that, as I say, are well known to policy experts. In a place like Levittown, for example, the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited future discrimination in housing. Homes there, as I said, now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. Levittown is now about 2% African American as a result of the federal government and the Fair Housing Act saying, in effect, okay, African Americans, you can now move to Levittown, about 2%. But it's in a broader neighborhood that's about 15% African American. That difference between 2% and 15% is the civil rights violation that created segregation that's never been remedied. What we should be doing as a matter of policy, the federal government should be buying up homes at Levittown at market rates and reselling them to African Americans at affordable rates, $100,000 or what their parents or grandparents would have paid had they been permitted to buy into a neighborhood like this. I actually, today is August 13th. Tomorrow, I'm publishing an article in the New York Times that goes into some great detail about how such a policy needs to be implemented. But there are other policies as well. We have several policies that try to address housing crisis for low-income families, not the kinds of families who could afford to move into single-family homes if they were priced reasonably, but low-income families. The biggest one is the low-income housing tax credit. It's administered by the federal government. The Treasury Department regulations for the low-income housing tax credit, a subsidy to builders to build housing for the lowest income families. The federal Treasury Department regulations place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's crazy. That's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be placing more, not all, but we should be placing more subsidized units in high opportunity places, places with access to good jobs and transportation and grocery stores, supermarkets that sell fresh food, schools that have high achievement, high achieving students. That's what we should be doing, not placing a priority on reinforcing segregation by placing all our subsidized units in low income neighborhoods. The same thing is true of the Section 8 program. I'm sure you're all familiar with a subsidy to families to rent apartments at average rental rates for a metropolitan area. That program also today reinforces segregation. First of all, zoning rules prohibit the construction of apartments that are affordable to rent for Section 8 voucher holders in many, many segregated white neighborhoods. Landlords in those neighborhoods, even if there are apartments available, refuse to rent to African Americans, to Section 8 voucher holders, because we're not enforcing the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act, in fact, doesn't even prohibit discriminating against Section 8 voucher holders. The result is that most Section 8 vouchers are used in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Obviously, if a family wants to use its voucher in a low-income segregated neighborhood, it should be permitted to do so, but that shouldn't be the only place or the primary place where they can be used. We should be creating incentives for families to use those vouchers in high opportunity places that I just described. Well, there are many, many policies like that we could be following to redress segregation. I want to close simply by saying that we have to examine and understand that segregation is a civil rights violation. It did not happen naturally. It's not de facto. It was created by government, and we, all of us, have an obligation to remedy it. There's no lack of policy ideas to do so. We need a new civil rights movement in this country that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain segregated patterns. And I hope that all of you will be part of that civil rights movement so that we can end this most serious stain on American society. The segregation that we have in every metropolitan area not only predicts the achievement gap that I described before by concentrating the most disadvantaged children in single schools. It determines health disparities between African Americans and white. Many African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods. It predicts the mass incarceration crisis and police abuse because it wouldn't happen to nearly the same extent. I'm not suggesting that we would not have any police abuse, but it wouldn't happen to nearly the same extent if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to jobs or opportunity, and where they inevitably are engaged in confrontations with the police who are there to control a low-income disadvantaged population. And finally, let me conclude with this. The segregation that we have in this society today is an important cause of the very, very dangerous and frightening political polarization that we have in the United States now. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever develop the common national identity that we need if we're going to preserve this democracy, if so many African Americans and so many whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other, to develop the common national identity that we need? So I want to thank you for your attention. And Julian, are we going to take questions now or move on? What do you want to do?
Thank you so much for that. There was so much information. I'm sure you get that often in your talk, and we really, really appreciate that. We had the privilege of listening to you at the latter part of today as well. But while we have you here, we did get a few questions. And so I'd like to ask them from a few of the people that were chiming in. One of those questions was, what role does the census play in all of this?
Well, the census, there are many problems with the way the census is presently being administered, as you know, but it's not, it itself is not a cause of residential segregation. The biggest problem with the census is that it undercounts lower income families because they're harder to find. We have families that double, tripled up in overcrowded conditions. And if a census taker comes to that residence, the census taker may only capture one of the families, not all of them. And federal funds are allocated to communities based on their population. So if we're undercounting the African American population or the Hispanic population for reasons I just described, or because Hispanics are afraid they're going to be accused of not being here legally and deported, whether it's true or not. If it undercounts those populations, less federal funds is available to improve the resources in those communities. It also affects the way in which we apportion congressional seats. So if we undercount populations of low-income minority families, it means they have fewer congressional representatives, fewer congresspeople than they should have. And that makes it more difficult to enact the kinds of policies that I described. So those are the ways that the census interacts with what I was describing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We've got a couple other questions I'd love to post here. You believe that higher cases of asthma are related to the living conditions in the communities that you were speaking about?
Yes. As I said, should I repeat that?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Well, yes. African American neighborhoods in urban areas, downtown, not middle class African American neighborhoods, but African American neighborhoods in urban areas are more polluted. In fact, one of the policies I talk about in The Color of Law is how in the 20th century and continuing on to the late 20th century, neighborhoods where African Americans lived were zoned to permit industrial use, sometimes toxic use, polluting use. Diesel trucks are more likely to drive through them. And these are the kinds of conditions that cause not only asthma, but other diseases that white families who live in suburban areas are not exposed to. African Americans in urban areas have asthma at 4 times the rate of white middle-class neighborhoods. And that affects not only their life expectancy of adults and the diseases of adults, but also the ability of children to come to school wide awake. So it's an example. It's only one of many, many examples of the kinds of social and economic conditions that exist in overcrowded, dense, polluted neighborhoods where African Americans are disproportionately concentrated because they have been excluded from many communities in this country in an unconstitutional fashion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I think we have time for 2 more questions before we transition to the next part of the day. The first one is with respect to the deeds that still say that certain homes can't be sold to Black people. How do we get those rewritten? And is that even possible?
Well, it's very, very difficult to rewrite those deeds. A deed to a home is permanent. You can't change the language in the deed. You can't change what you think your property line should be. The deed is the deed. And if it says it's only can be sold to a Caucasian, that's what the deed is going to say. It's a very, very expensive and really impractical policy to try to remove that language, to go to court and remove that language. You can't do it practically speaking. What I recommend is that you insist, and you can do this, that as an amendment be attached to the deed. You can't remove the language, but attach an amendment to the deed saying that we are horrified that our home includes this kind of language. We welcome all people to our community. We hope to have a diverse community. We're ashamed, we're embarrassed that our government permitted this kind of language to exist. And the reason that's a good idea is that if we simply, even if it were possible, if we remove that language, it will remove the opportunity to educate future generations about the horrific, unconstitutional policies that government followed. If we attach the kind of language that I suggested, affirmative language saying that we welcome everybody to this community. We want to have a diverse community. We're ashamed and embarrassed about the language in this deed. That serves the purpose of both affirmatively encouraging desegregation, but also of showing people what actually happened in the 20th century to create the segregation that we have.
Thank you. Thank you for that. One final question. This is actually a personal question. And I'm thinking about myself, but I'm also thinking about a lot of the other people who have been listening to this. And quite frankly, it's dreary. It's heavy. And you've been studying this stuff. You're an expert in this field. And so we're dealing with that. We're dealing with, in certain ways, feeling trapped, if you will, in our homes and not being able to travel and be as free. How do you maintain positivity or optimism, when you know all of these things and, you see how stubborn change has been? Do you even maintain a optimistic outlook?
Well, Julian, I'm very hopeful, not confident, but hopeful. I look at your generation and I think you're going to fix this. So long as we thought that racial segregation occurred by accident, that it wasn't intentional, it's easy to think it can only unhappen by accident. And how can we imagine that happening? Once we understand that it was a deliberate policy of government, it's easy to understand that government can also fix it. What government did, government can unfix. So knowing this history is, I think, empowering. It removes the fatalism that is natural if we think it all happened by accident. And what happened by policy can unhappen by policy. And as I said to you earlier, I think you and your generation are going to create a new civil rights movement that's going to make it as uncomfortable to maintain residential segregation as my generation did to make it uncomfortable to maintain segregation in water fountains and lunch counters and buses and the like.
Yeah, thank you. There's a gentleman by the name of John Hope Bryant who started and runs an organization called Operation Hope. And he says something to the effect of the new civil rights movement being a silver rights movement, meaning it's going to be much more about economic policy. And so we thank you for your insight and your wisdom today. I think you're definitely talking to the right group of people because we know that a lot of people watching this are not just influencers. Many of them are influential within finance, within banking, within financial media. And then we have others who are really just curious and interested in this conversation as a whole, because they want to know more about the history of the United States and how it is shaping their present lives so that they can be a bit more strategic about how we're going to create the sort of change that you are referring to. And so I thank you, but I'm not saying goodbye because we know we will see you in about an hour or so. Right now, what we're going to do is pause, and then we're going to introduce our next speaker. And so for those that are watching, we're going to ask you to tap back into that pool of patience. I believe he is already here. His name is Sean Rochester. He is the CEO of Good Steward, the founder of PhD Enterprises and the IDEA Institute. These organizations provide financial education and advisory services to consumers. They increase the presence of Black employees and enterprises in U.S. public and private sectors payroll and supply chains, and facilitate commerce between the Black business community across the African diaspora and on the African continent. Mr. Rochester is also an author, sought-after speaker who's spoken on Wall Street and Silicon Valley, leading universities and the United Nations about the staggering financial costs of discrimination against Black people in America and a new economic framework to help create the millions of jobs and businesses that are missing in the Black community. Sean has received citations from the New York State Assembly and the New York City Council for his work in economic development, and was also selected by the International Human Rights Commission Relief Fund Trust to be listed in its 2019 Almanac as one of the top 100 human rights defenders for his efforts to educate people on the financial cost of discrimination, both past and present, against members of the African diaspora in America. I believe he chimed in a bit earlier, and I am now seeing him here. And so without delay, Mr. Rochester, how are you, sir?
Julian, I'm doing great. Can you hear and see me?
I can hear and see you. If I don't want to make the same mistake twice. And so Richard insisted that I call him Richard, but if my mama sees me talking to you and I don't call you Mr. Rochester, I might get slapped in the back of the head. So I'm gonna insist that I refer to you as such. I'm going to say hello. I'm going to remove myself from the screen and pass the digital stage to you. Does that sound like a plan?
That sounds fantastic. Thank you very much, Julian. I appreciate it.
Okay.
I am going to switch over and bring up some charts here, and then we will kick things off from that point. I think I need screen sharing to be enabled. Can you do that for me?
It was just a second there, Sean.
No worries. Gotta love technology.
We're making it work. Give us just a moment there, folks.
I'm actually grateful for the technology that allows us to be together, at least digitally, while it's we're not able to be together, physically. So
I hear you. Hold on. I think Sandy is behind the scenes here trying to make this work. What do you see when we're saying it's showing that our
I
functionality?
think it's working. Let's try it now.
Perfect.
Okay. Show. All right. Can you see these? This chart?
Yes, we're all good.
Fantastic. I just want everyone to know that Julian and I worked on that all morning, so it looked like the technology wasn't working quite as we had planned it, right? Just to make sure everybody stays on their toes. So thank you guys for having me as part of this awesome event. And Julian, thank you for that wonderful introduction. As was said, my name is Sean Rochester, and I am the author of a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And that book is about the financial cost of discrimination against Black people. Now, very often when we talk about discrimination, we tend to speak about it from the perspective of the injustice or the immorality associated with it. In the work that I did with this book, I wanted to look at it from a different perspective. I wanted to look at what is the financial cost of that discrimination, and more importantly, what do universities, researchers from the finest universities in the country say that cost is. The book is broken down into three parts. In the first part, I look at what I call the present black tax, which is the financial cost of discrimination in markets that are really critical to wealth accumulation. So that's the housing and the automotive, the insurance and the financing that underpins those. It's the job search, high-end careers, online commerce, as well as capital raising for business. The second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery up until the present, where I kind of walk through and quantify discriminatory practices against Black people. The third part of the book, I do a summary of kind of where we are now economically and introduce a framework that I call PhD. And PhD stands for Purchase, Hire, and Deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand businesses, and provide capital in the Black community. Why is this of particular importance? It's because pre-COVID, we were missing about 6 million jobs across the broader Black community. We're missing about 1.4 million businesses with employees across the broader Black communities. And as you may know, There are about 2.56 million Black businesses. Only about 4% of those actually have employees. It's roughly 109, 110,000 companies. But that 4% generates about 70% of all the revenue from Black enterprise, roughly $100 billion, and they employ about 1 million people. So these are really, really critical businesses. There's only about 109, 110,000 of them, and we're missing 1.4 million, right? And in addition to that, those things are also driving the wealth gap, which is well over $8 trillion across our collective balance sheets. So we're talking about really massive, huge problems that we need to be able to address. And as is the case with any form of effective problem solving, we need to look at a few things. One of the things that is important to do is get a bunch of people at the table who can help us all resolve the problem. But it's really tough to work with folks if one, they don't see the problem, or if two, they think you're the problem. So if I would just fix me, then we would be great. And here's some platitudes that you guys may have heard. One, Black folks are simply not trying hard enough. That has more to do with getting ahead than any kind of racial discrimination. You got over 6 in 10 Americans that believe that. You may have heard that, Black folks have the same or better chance as their white peers to get ahead in America. You got 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you might have heard that racism, quite frankly, is an excuse for failure. Right? And a failure is mine. I don't own it. I spend my time blaming everyone else. We're not the only people who faced discrimination or hardships over time. Other people have faced that as well, and they've gone on to progress economically, yet Black people are kind of where we are. You've got over 7 out of 10, Americans believe that. But the challenge is, if that's the thinking and the background resonance, then that level of thinking is going to show up in the policies and the plans and the programs that are actually devised to address these very issues, which is problematic in and of itself. And one thing that's really important for us all to understand is that effective problem solving requires, two critical things. One is empathy, and the other is understanding. And empathy is simply just your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and to see it from their perspective, right? And to understand the pathology, right? How they got to that position in the first place. And understanding is just how we use facts and information and data, so on and so forth, to make the world a better place for ourselves and for our fellow man. So one of the things I want to do is I want to share with you a quote. And this quote is from Albert Einstein in an address that he gave to the National Urban League back in 1946. And he said, "We must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, violence, and economic discrimination is by definition the Black tax, will be made known to the people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken." So in the spirit of advice from Mr. Einstein, let's talk about it. So in the time that I have with you today, what I'm going to do is talk about how is it that after 400 years, over 40 million African Americans own just 2% of US wealth, right? Either we are colossally and consistently inept, or there is something else going on in the background, right? So let's take a look at what that might be. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to a time of slavery, right? I'm not going to go through all of the horrors associated with that. Many folks, have written about those things. But what I want to do is look at things from an economic perspective, right? But a very critical thing for us all to understand is that slavery, by definition, is a 100% tax on your labor, right? Nothing that you produce is yours, not even you, right, or yours. Now, there are many things that, we could never value, right? From that time. You could never value what it means to be a woman and to be unable to have control over your body for the entirety of your life. You could never value what it means to know that your child could be sold at any point. You can never value what it is to be a man and be unable to protect your mother or wife or loved ones, or to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor, so on and so forth. But the things that you can value, right, is the labor extracted, right, from millions of people over a quarter of a millennia, right? And economists have taken a look at that. Some say the number is up to 24 trillion. Others say it's up to 97 trillion. If we assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, it could be as high as $50 trillion. If that number is large and rather new to you, that's not the only thing that we can value from that time, right? If you go back to the 1860s, you have roughly 4 million people held in bondage, right? And those people represent the most liquid asset in the country, and they're traded on open markets. There's a price if you're old or young or male, female, able-bodied, or lame. So it turns out that the value of those people is so large that you have to measure it in terms of either national wealth or GDP. So from an economic standpoint, economists say that the value of those people from a wealth standpoint is between 16 and 20% of US wealth, or 1 to 2 years of GDP. Now, if you put that in today's equivalent and you look at it from a wealth standpoint, the value of those folks is about 15.5 trillion. How does one arrive at that number? Well, US wealth pre-COVID was about $85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. Take an average of those two, you're at 15.5. If you look at it from an income standpoint or national income standpoint, it's roughly 28.5 trillion dollars. How does one arrive at that? Well, national income or GDP prior to COVID was about $19 trillion a year. 1 to 2 years of that is 19 to 38 trillion. Take an average of those two things, you're at 28.5. Two different modes of measuring it. If you take an average of those modes, it's about $22 trillion. Now, you can measure these people in other ways, and you're going to come close to this $22 trillion number. If you go back to the 1839, Henry Clay is in the U.S. Senate, estimates that the value of people held in bondage at that time is roughly $1.2 billion. Thomas Piketty says that slave-related investments yield generally 6 to 7% a year. If you use 5.5%, you're at $24+ trillion. If you go back to the 1810s, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison placed the value of people held in bondage at that time at roughly 1 year GDP, the equivalent of $19 trillion today, or needing to sell 1/3 of all publicly available land. So I think that the point here is these are massive, gargantuan, hard to kind of comprehend numbers. There's no way to separate, what was extracted from these people and invested in the country from the prosperity of the country today. So if you think about during that period, we're talking about, $50 trillion. Now you could say, that's a large number, right? I didn't see that coming, but this was over 150 years ago. And, there was plenty of time to accumulate resources. Since then, millions of people have come here and they've gone on to do well, right? And I would say, all right, well, let's take some context before we kind of move in that direction. And one of the things to think about is, first, let's just start to think about what the economic implication is, right? If you look at what the net worth of 45 million Black people are today, it's roughly 1.5 trillion. We just said those 4 million people were worth about 22 trillion, today's equivalent. Which would imply that 4 million people held in bondage over 150 years ago was worth 15 times more to the country than 45 million Black people free, at this point in time, which is, a very remarkable thing. The other thing that we have to consider in terms of like, why has it been so difficult to accumulate resources is that these folks left bondage with no economic resources. In 1870, they owned about 0.17% of US wealth. Right? Not quite zero, but very, very close to it. So, and we all know about 40 acres and a mule. And you may remember Homestead Act, from junior high school or middle school. And the 40 acres and a mule was part of what was discussed as potential starting resources for newly freed people. This clearly never happened, right? But one interesting question is, what would that have been worth, right, if it did happen? And if you take a look at that and you set the mule aside, there's actually tremendous value associated with the mule. But if you look at the land just for the moment, you're talking about roughly 160 million acres, right? 4 million people times 40 acres is a tremendous amount. I once looked at buying some land with a group of friends, 400 acres. You got to go up in a helicopter to see 400 acres, right? 160 million is really hard to comprehend. And if you just looked at what the price of that would be, right? Price of an acre is between $3,020 and $6,350. Again, these are not Manhattan area acres. These are not Bay Area acres. These are not downtown Chicago acres. These are not, Miami Beach acres. This is farmland kind of pricing associated with it. Quick math puts you at roughly $1 trillion on the high end, right? Generating about, a billion, about $90 billion per year. Now, $1 trillion seems like a lot, right? But it's about 2% of the 50 trillion that was estimated to be extracted from those folks over a 250-year period. And it's about 4.5% of the 22 trillion that those folks themselves were worth, right? Prior to that. So not even this amount was allowed as a startup resources. But at the same time, you actually do have land that was distributed, right? In 1862, Congress passes the Homestead Act, in which they would proceed to to distribute 246 million acres to 1.5 million white families, right? If you apply the same math, right, it gets you to about $1.6 trillion, or a little over $1 million a family, right? Now, I'm all about hard working and bootstrapping, but $1 million is a hell of bootstrap. So if you think about, how did it work? You had the opportunity to claim about 160 acres of land. And if you were so fortunate as to be able to claim that land, if you stayed on it for 5 years, you would be able to take possession of it, right? For no other consideration. Now, if you were an immigrant coming from Europe with literally nothing but the shirt on your back, and you were so fortunate to be able to claim one of these parcels of land, at the end of 5 years, not only did you take possession of that land, but you also were able to naturalize. That's about how long it took to gain U.S. citizenship back in those days. That's about 5 years, right? So you become a citizen and have this extraordinary gift. Researchers say that in terms of direct beneficiaries, it's up to 93 million white Americans are direct beneficiaries. That's not secondary, tertiary related in some kind of way. It's direct. So at one point you have over $1 trillion not distributed, and then you have $1.6 trillion distributed to a significant group of people. If you fast forward a little bit, you start to see the impact of the Civil War, where you have the Southern economy is devastated, the global cotton market is devastated, all the land that was confiscated from the South because of the war, the succession attempts, was returned to the white planter class, and there is a massive need for cheap, abundant, available labor. Now, I fast forwarded through a bunch of stuff there, so I'm just going to circle back and provide a little more color. One of the things that we have to understand is when we say the Southern economy is devastated, those people held in bondage were 50% of the full economic value of the South. When we say that the global cotton market was devastated, you have to understand that cotton was the first truly global industry, right? It was like the equivalent of oil today. It was like the equivalent of oil today. 20 million people around the world are employed in that industry. 1 million of those people lose their jobs because of the Civil War and emancipation. And the world is crying out in terms of a global cotton famine. You have to remember also that the US dominates 80% of that market globally. 61% of all exports are the raw cotton picked by these 4 million people, right? This is a huge deal. It affects the entire world. It affects, India and China, Russia. It affects Japan. It affects Egypt, so on and so forth. And people are like, what is America going to do to put her newly free people back to work? Right? And the answer to that becomes this solution called Jim Crow. One of the least descriptive names for a period that one can think of. So, what is this Jim Crow? And Jim Crow is really a system of laws and customs that is reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence to reimpose a 100% tax on the sharecropper's labor. Now, I know you might be thinking, listen, that sounds a little hyperbolic, right? 100% tax. Clearly, these people were poor, but surely they had something, right? And what I'll do is I'll let you decide whether or not it was 100% tax, right? So let's let's talk about this. So what is sharecropping, and fundamentally, how does it work? In effect, it's a contract, right? So those large mega plantations were broken into smaller lots. Black families would agree to settle on those lots, and they would agree to plant cash crops. And in exchange for all the work they would do planting those crops, at the time of harvest, when they brought it to market, they would share in a portion of the crop. That's literally where the name comes from, like sharecropping. And it is literally a contract that would be made between a white farmer and the sharecroppers who are on the land. Part of the challenge is that all of the terms and conditions associated with that contract are set by the white farmer. Some of those terms and conditions state that if you fell ill, then they have the right to outsource your labor to someone else and then charge you back, for it. The other thing that you have to understand is that the harvest doesn't come tomorrow. It comes at the end of the season. And these people have effectively no real significant resources. So between now and the time of harvest, the white farmer's got to provide them with the food, clothes, shelter, seed, tools, fertilizer, all the things that they need to actually bring things to market and sustain themselves. And they're doing it at rates as high as 70% per year. So effectively, they control your cost structure, right? All your expenses. The other challenge is that at the end of the season, when you take these crops to market, the white farmer is the market. He tells you what those crops are worth. So if someone controls your revenue or your income, because they tell you what your product is worth, and they control your expenses because they are financing you at these draconian rates, they effectively control your profit. And I think you see where 100% tax comes in. Now, if you're fortunate, your profit will net to zero, right? If you're unfortunate, because they want to make sure that you don't go to someone else who's more generous, what they will do is your profit will be negative, and then they'll roll that into the next year. And now you start to get into perpetual debt servitude, right? Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Which is, that's a horrible deal, right? I would never take that deal or agree to that. And I agree with you, and I wouldn't want to do it either. But here's the problem. If you don't take the deal, they got a law for that. And those laws are called vagrancy laws. And it says if you can't prove that you're gainfully employed or that you are a landowner, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Like you said, I didn't see that one coming. I'll sign the contract, but second thought, just not going to do the work because it's a horrible deal. Well, they got a law for that. It's called contract enforcement laws. So if you break that contract, again, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, if you get frustrated or exasperated, or you just say, I don't care, I'll sit in jail, right? And you can give me 3 square meals a day. And when you let me out, you let me out. They have something for that, and it's called convict leasing, which means that they will lease you back out to the very small white farmer that you didn't want to work for in the first place, or to a private corporation. And one of the things you need to understand about convict leasing is there is one aspect of it that you could argue is even worse than slavery, just kind of in this one respect, which is that while a slave owner will kill you or beat you within an inch of your life, they would rather have you around for another 10 or 5 or 10 or 15 years to maximize their return on investment because slaves are expensive, right? Under convict leasing, they have no such interest in your future. They have no interest in your residual value. They only care about you for the period of time that you're under contract with them, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. That's it. Your future beyond that is of no interest. So you're under those conditions, you're looking at death rates as high as 50%. That's a 1 in 2 chance of death, right? Now you have to juxtapose that with the fact that it's incredibly lucrative. If you go back to like 1914, 20% of the state of Alabama's revenues are coming from convict leasing alone, right? So this is, something that's significant, right? And you also have to remember, this wasn't like a short period that was a turbulent period that ended very quickly, right? We go through these short periods. This lasted, right, for 75 years. And during this time, it's been documented that 4,000 Black people have been lynched, killed publicly by their, fellow Americans. And this is that we know. The numbers is surely much, higher than that. So, and people were not prosecuted during these times, right? You have a sharecropper from the Mississippi Delta that said, listen, I've been working this Delta for 30 years, and I know that every year I've been robbed, but what can you do? If you speak up, you get cussed. If you raised up, you get shot, right? So I think you see the imposition of a 100% tax on your labor, right? Which means that it's slavery by definition. And that's why people refer to this period of time by slavery as another name. So if you think about the fact that potentially up to 50 trillion was extracted from people over almost 250 year period during the portion of legal slavery. And then you have this portion of effective slavery that lasts another 75 years, which is a third longer. You can argue that another 15 trillion was extracted from those people, during that period of time, right? So what does that mean? While that white power structure lost the equivalent of $22 trillion upon emancipation, right, and the Civil War, they clawed back 15 trillion of that from those people and their descendants, right, over the next 75 years, which is substantial. So you might say, okay, well, not everyone was under that Jim Crow regime, right? I mean, some people were able to get an education, right? Education clearly is the great equalizer. W.E.B. Du Bois was able to go to Harvard, right? During the early, 1900s. And yeah, education is a great equalizer, but we also have to look at things in context, which was during these early periods, the white planter class was looking for massive, cheap, abundant labor. They were not looking for a class of Black people to be educated, right? White farmers, small farmers clearly wanted the expansion of public education for themselves and their children. Newly freed, Black Americans wanted expansion of public education for themselves and their children, right? The white planter class were not interested in that. Obviously, they educated their children through a private school system, but they needed the cooperation of the smaller white farmers. So they decided upon expanding public education with the intent of diverting resources from Black children to, white children. So Du Bois says that they were so effective at doing that his words are, in the 40 years since emancipation, Negro taxes and a Negro share of income from indirect taxes and endowments has fully repaid any investment, right, that made in the Negro's education by white Americans. If we go and look at the words of, a Confederate general and industrialist, his name is Thomas Logan, in terms of what their thought process was, he said, when the freed man regards himself qualified to earn a support by mental work, he is unwilling to accept manual labor. So when the work requires intellectual horsepower, if you allow them to think and know and believe that, they will not accept the manual labor. And then if you fast forward to 1914, you see that William H. Baldwin, who's the president of the General Education Board, you can think of that as the Department of Education before the Department of Education, says that in the South, Negroes needed to be educated so that they would be the best possible laborers, right? With the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work menial jobs, and this will open up opportunities for the Southern whites to perform the more expert labor, right? So the idea is underdevelop these people and their children, so they'll focus on menial work and not that requires intellectual prowess. If you fast forward to 1917, there are only about 64 public high schools in the South, right, for Black children to access. Again, that's not in a county, it's not in a state, that's across the entirety, right, of the South. So, and most of the schools in the K through 12 system are owned and built, by Black people. So if you think about New York City during that time, back in 1920, they're spending 50 times more on the education of the children in the New York City school system than South Carolina is spending on Black students in their segregated system. And at this time, New York City is about 97.1% white during that time. So if you were an immigrant, you came to the country through, the Ellis Island, and you stayed in that area while you came with kind of nothing, but the shirt on your back. You're moving into a community that was spending 50 times more on the human capital development of your children than Black students whose, predecessors have been here for, hundreds of years. In the South, $1 for every dollar invested in a Black child, 5 to 8 are invested in a white child. It's not rocket science. If you do that with your own children, one's going to be impoverished, one's going to go to Harvard. Black teachers are making about 25 cents to 34 cents on a dollar for what their white peers are making, teaching the same subjects. And white students are receiving 50% more years of education by the time that they're 25. So Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, and he's also a Nobel Prize winner, said that in the last 50 years, he said this in the 50s, 40 to 50 years, Negroes have advanced little in relative position to their white peers. So basically, you open a new factory, you have another janitor, not another manager, right? The diversion of resources is so effective that you see very little augmented proportional decrease. And researchers say that if Black students have received the same level of investment, right? If you kept the other types of discrimination the same, but just invested equally in the children in the school system, that could have cut the earnings gap alone by about, 50%. So when you think about that, over the course of millions of children, right, within a generation, that's over $600 billion of opportunity loss when you think about that from that 1990-year period, right, from 1965 to 1954. It's well over $3 trillion of opportunity cost. That's the malinvestment and the maldevelopment of Black people from the educational system, right? A tremendous cost. How does one accumulate, wealth under those circumstances? Now you might say, and it would be not inaccurate to say that back in the day, you didn't need a super duper education, right? Many people have a story about a grandfather, great-grandfather who had a 3rd or 5th grade education, a terrific work ethic, right? And accomplished quite a bit, during that period of time, right? So, and was able to buy or build a home and did great things for his family. So, which is true, home ownership is the great, wealth builder, clearly. It's part of the American dream. It's part of the American ethos, and the government invests in it heavily, right? And people believe in it deeply. So much so that the federal government invested, at the time, about $120 billion of subsidies into U.S. homeowners, about the equivalent of $1 trillion investment today, which is huge. It created, in effect, the middle class, the property middle class, was something new that people had never really seen before. But the problem is less than 2% of those resources were invested into Black Americans, right? While 20 million Europeans who arrived during that period of time, after they naturalized, were able to access those resources. So, you're aware of the role of the FHA in redlining, right? And that the financial institutions followed suit. If you went to the developers would not work with you. The realtors would not participate in transactions if you wanted to purchase a home. In a white community, it was better resource. Even the residents decide to sign covenants amongst themselves to say that they'll only sell to a European or a person of Caucasian descent, right? So you got a line of opposition, right? A phalanx preventing people from participating in this massive government investment. Now, while that all sounds very, very qualitative, what we can say very definitively is that from 1930 to 1960, less than 1% of all mortgages in the nation went to Black people. Now, if you think about the greatest wealth building vehicle ever, right, is the American housing, right, over the last century and a half, and you were largely unable to participate. Now, just because you can't get a mortgage, right, or a subsidized mortgage doesn't mean that you don't want to be a homeowner. You still want to be a homeowner. So what people have to do is they turn to private markets under these constructs called contract sales, right? And in these private markets, appraisals aren't required. So homes are being sold at 2x the normal price. And you've had these draconian interest rates associated with it. But one of the worst thing of all is that as you're making payments, you actually don't accumulate any equity in the home. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Like if we decided that after 100 installment payments, I would take possession of a home that someone was selling to me, and I made 99 of those payments successfully and missed the 100, they would have the ability to evict me from that home, keep my 99 payments plus my down payment, and sell the home to someone else, right? I would have earned no equity, right, in that home, and all the maintenance costs are my responsibility, right? Extremely difficult to accumulate resources under these constructs, right? The other thing is, if you said, well, I'll just settle down in these communities where we have been forced into, we can't really get out of till things blow over, and then we'll kind of move forward. You know, the rents inside these Black urban communities are over 50% more than outside of them. Now, at first thought, that seems counterintuitive. Why would something that's less desirable be worth, cost more to live there, right? But you have to remember the context, which is you've got millions of people fleeing the tyranny of the South and unable to move into white communities and being corralled into these Black urban so-called ghetto communities. So what happens when the demand for housing goes up faster than the actual housing? The price goes up. And that's exactly what you start to see within these areas. If you go back to 1968, the Federal Trade Commission did a study, and they found that goods and services within these communities were 3 times more than outside these communities. Again, very difficult to accumulate wealth under that construct. And if you look into the labor market, you just settle down, work hard, try to save as much as you can. This will pass. Researchers estimate that between 1930 and 1970, there's about $1.6 trillion of labor market discrimination against Black people, right? That's in 1983 dollars. It's over 4 trillion if you look at it in today's equivalent. Again, extremely difficult to accumulate wealth, right, under these contexts. And this is part of the reason why when you look back and you hear that white Americans born between 1943 and 1951 would go on to accumulate 11 times more wealth than Black Americans, you start to see why that would be the case. We're normally told that's about hard work, stick-to-itiveness, and making the right decisions, but we see that the environment in which you are living plays a significant role, right, as a driver to those things. So when it comes to housing and labor, we're talking about well over $4 trillion. Now, I won't have time to go into the New Deal, right, or the GI Bill, but that's the equivalent of about over $1 trillion of capital infusion, right, into the economy and into soldiers coming back from World War II, or the interstate highway construction, right, which would be about $600 billion in today's equivalent. You also have the Black tax from the time of civil rights up until the present, right, which is over $3 trillion. All of this is covered in the book, which you can get at www.blacktax.com, which is in the corner right. But we can talk a little bit about where are we right now, right? What did all this, plus many other things that I was unable to kind of speak about, lead us to be, right, in kind of broad economic terms. So Black community is currently missing about $1.5 trillion in business and consumer revenue. 1 trillion of that is business, 520 billion of that is associated with consumer revenue. It's well over $8 trillion, worth missing from our collective balance sheets. And of course, it talked about the missing jobs and businesses, 6 million jobs, 1.4 million businesses. Pre-COVID, these numbers have been exacerbated, clearly because of the onset of COVID and all the economic implications associated with that. When I was doing research for this book, I kept seeing this number coming up again and again and again, right? It seemed like there's some kind of 2% rule or paradigm associated with Black economic advancement. So in areas that are really critical to wealth accumulation, it seems like Black people participate around the 2% level. So some examples of those are less than 2% of all corporate supply chain spend is with Black enterprise, less than 2% of all government supply chain spend, federal, state, local, is with Black enterprise. Again, I'm speaking specifically about Black enterprise, not kind of the giant, their minority category. When it comes to the spend from Black people themselves, less than 2% of that is on Black enterprise. We typically represented it as less than 2% on almost all high growth, high compensation careers and occupations, and just about $4 out of every $10,000 in the U.S. banking system is inside of a Black bank, which means there's not enough liquidity to be able to provide for the financing needs of even small parts of the Black population. SBA lending, less than 2% of that, 1.6% is the number, goes to Black enterprise. So all of this creates a very large negative depressive impact on job creation and business development in the Black community. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is, when I did a talk at Google a couple of years ago at a corporate headquarters, I got asked this really great question. And people were like, well, we understand to a fuller extent what the cost has been for Black people, but could you tell us a little bit also about what the cost has been for the country? I thought that was a brilliant question. I didn't have the answer at the time, right? But I said I would take a look at it. And I did, and I was fortunate to be asked to come back to speak there again. And this is how I approach answering that question, right? And I framed it in this kind of context, which is, what if Black Americans have been allowed to participate fully in the innovation system that drove the economy, right? So this period that we've been talking about, that I've been talking about, with this 1870 to 1945, this Jim Crow period, is also an extremely important part of the Industrial Revolution, right? You've got 2.5 million patents are created during this period of time. You've got, we're talking about innovations like, airplanes and automobiles and radios and transistors and light bulbs, motion pictures, telephone. The foundation, right, of our economy was all, created during that period of time. How many of those patents, how much of that innovation came from Black people? It's about 726, right? Almost a complete shutout and ability to really be able to participate. Now, why is this of great importance? If we take a look at, what Professor Kortum from Yale has to say, he says patents can be thought of as proportional improvements in productivity. A constant flow of new patents can generate a constant rate of economic growth. This is super critical, right? It's the innovation that drives the system. The innovation is protected through the patent system. The Brookings Institute says that nations' unequal access to high quality schooling deprives the innovation system of large numbers of people who might otherwise be able to make and commercialize important discoveries, right? Now, something that's really critical, I need to just emphasize and re-emphasize, which is that talent, skill, capability follows a normal distribution. Fancy way of saying 70% of the people are in the middle, right? They're average to good. 15% of the people are substantially above, right? I call that category the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group. And then 15% of people are significantly below. That's cross race, cross ethnicity, it's cross religions, cross whatever country. That's just the normal or Gaussian spread, right, of that. So a question that I thought was really, really important to look at, right, which is, what was that ultra brilliant population doing when we look at this timeline that we have just been exploring? And what was the size of that population, right? So if you look at that, you see that in 1870, that population, about 730,000 people. Again, that's not the population of Black people. That's just as 15% of ultra brilliant, right? 1900, it's about 1.3 million. By the time you get to 1930, it's about 1.8 million, right? 1935, you got 3.5, 3.6, 3.7 million people still working in the fields. By the time you get to 1950, it's almost 2.3 million people. In the 1940s, only about 1.6% of Black people even have, a college education. So it is a complete and utter underutilization of extraordinary levels of talent and capability, not participating in the innovation system. What if they had? What would have been the impact? We could have expected to see about 280,000 incremental patents on top of what was done during that period of time. That would have contributed to an increase of $2 trillion to GDP. If you look at the work from McKinsey and Company that they did on closing the wealth gap, they said if you close the wealth gap, it would generate $1.5 trillion in incremental GDP, right, for the country. And it would have led to over $9 trillion, right, of incremental wealth for the nation as a whole. So the cost of not including those people has been extraordinary, clearly for Black people, and absolutely for the country as a whole. A researcher from the University of Michigan, or Michigan State University, did a really interesting study where she asked a great question, which is, what if white Americans had experienced a level of trauma that Black Americans experienced during that Jim Crow period? What would have happened specifically to innovation, right? And her work says that about 40% of those patents would have never been created, right? If that level of trauma had been experienced on the other side. That could have cost almost 8 trillion in lost GDP. That would have cost the nation about over 30 trillion, right, in national wealth. So the costs are significant and are dramatic. Now, I want to share 2 quotes with you as I kind of wrap up this portion of the talk and the presentation. And the first, again, is from Albert Einstein during his address to the National Urban League. And he said, the worst disease under which the society of our nation suffers, in his opinion, in my opinion, is the treatment of the Negro. We saw some of the financial impact of that treatment, right? And a little bit in the talk, and you can see much more in the book itself. And Emperor Selassie, in a speech to the United Nations General Assembly back in 1963, said the basis of racial discrimination has been economic, and it is with economics that these evils can be overcome. So with that said, I'm going to pause here. We can talk a little bit about solutions, the PhD economic framework, and an important point, which is that minority does not mean Black.
Mr. Rochester, I think it's fair to say, even though I can't see everyone that is paying attention, that there's a collective explosion of heads right now, right? We don't have like graphics to throw in right now, but I think it's safe to say that a lot of people are, well, one, I think those who are already aware of some of these things feel as if their perspective has been fortified, they feel a bit validated, they hear it from you. I think those who did not know these things, or maybe were on the cusp of sort of getting there, because quite frankly, it can be intimidating. I think this was a bit of a, it woke them up a little bit. And so I thank you for that. As someone that is passionate about these sorts of things, this was all of the above for me. And so thank you for sharing all that you did. And we're really fortunate because we know we also get to have both you and Mr. Rothstein and a few other people on a panel together. And so I'm going to ask the audience and the people that are watching to don't faint yet. Hold on, because there's even more really great and meaningful stuff coming up. We have a couple of questions, but I am going to be a little selfish because I have questions myself based on some of the things that you said. And I think that's going to buy us a little bit more time so that we can synthesize some of the questions that came in from the audience. And I apologize if you mentioned this, but one of the things that I asked this question to an audience not too long ago, and it was about technology and the role that the digital divide has played in wealth creation, specifically for the Black community. Is that a part of any of the research that you've done? And if so, what do you see when you're looking at any of that information with respect to the Black community in wealth creation? Like, has technology and the recent advancements in technology and arguably the exclusion of Black people and a part of that process exacerbated the issue that you've already spoken to?
Yeah, so I would kind of look at it from this perspective, which is how is the Black tax limiting our ability to participate, right, in technology, and how does technology exacerbate the Black tax? Because tech is massive, right? It's multi-trillion-dollar space. So when you talk about being able to participate, like if you go back to the 90s, remember you had the telecom, massive telecom growth and explosion, right? Because the formation of the internet and all of the underpinnings of that, right? And then that transferred into a digital version, which was the .com based economy, right? So now everybody's moving to like this kind of online, infrastructure. That transitions, obviously into like money going into real estate, and we have all the trauma associated with that. But then you've also got a transition now that's happening with digital currency and all the things associated with it. From the perspective, all of that requires capital for you to participate. Even if you are aware, fully cognizant that these things are happening and you should be there, do you have the capital to really be able to participate, right? That winds up being the growing theme again and again and again, whether it's technology or real estate, brick and mortar, or if it's even something else, right? The marijuana becoming legal and that creating economic opportunities is still massive, capital requirements, right? So when you're operating at a 2% level of the U.S. wealth, and by the way, that's hyper concentrated in a smaller group of Black people. A third of Black people's wealth is negative, right? Zero or negative, and that's going to 50%, right? Over the course of the next, third year or so. So it's very difficult to participate if you don't have the capital base, right? Now, when you start thinking about how do you utilize capital, technology to help you, even in the middle of COVID, right? Where you have the switch, where it's much more difficult at the K through 12 level with all of our young students, right? So now, do you have the bandwidth? Do you have all of the equipment, right, that's necessary with kids who are coming from highly disenfranchised communities to begin with? The technology will allow you to bridge the gap, right? But do you have the infrastructure, right, to be able to participate as fully? So when I look at things, I look at everything from like a PhD perspective, jobs, business, capital, right? The lack of capital can be a huge impediment to participating as an owner, right? Whatever kind of equity stake, whether it's the markets, we get a fractional stake, or you're investing, or to be able to utilize technology to help you, right? We're in a better situation than other people. Our kids have a more robust infrastructure. It's easier for them to adjust to it than other young people who may not have the technology at home, the computers, the various kind of pads and devices and so on and so forth. That's kind of like my quick thought on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's something I think about a lot. But you're absolutely right. I mean, even in the process of my wife and I having those conversations, we recognize our own privilege in the fact that we have that we're even aware or mindful of these things, that we have the ability to synthesize that information, and we have the capital to invest. And so thank you for your thoughts on that. I'm going to be selfish again, and I'm going to ask one other question because I fear that I may not get a chance to. A lot of your information that you shared was US based. And I know personally, a lot of the people that are influencers in this space actually have Caribbean roots. And so I'm curious as to whether or not you have, whether it's a part of your book, your website, or if you can point us to a resource where we might be able to get a Caribbean perspective on the Black economic experience.
Right. So I'm from Barbados. I was born in Barbados.
I didn't want to assume. I can tell in your face you look like about 5 cousins of mine, but go ahead.
Right. So the focus of the work was on the Black tax that's happening in the United States. Mm-hmm. Right. People from around the world read my book, or they check out my online talks, and they're like, the same thing's happening here. Right? Whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Canada, right? Whether it's in the Caribbean, when you get to the ownership of the actual economy, right? It's in the hands of hyper-concentrated hands of the few that are largely non-Black, typically white specifically, right? Where you have these levels of discrimination that's emanating in ways that have significant costs. So and by the way, there's a Black tax on the continent, right? Associated with it. So you could actually do a Black tax in these different areas. I just did the one starting from the US because of the power and the centrality of the US economically and really the history of the country as it sits in a global context, and where Black people here or Africans here sit in all of that wealth creation.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. I want to get to a couple of these other questions here. One of them was with respect to Germany. There's a comment here. I'm just going to read it verbatim, they're saying that Germany paid reparations. Why can't the US?
Um,
One, is that true? Do you know? And two, what are your thoughts on that, if you know?
yeah, the reparations that I think they're referring to is what the Germans or the country paid to Jewish people, right? Because they orchestrated the killing of over 6 million Jewish people, right? During the Second World War. So they pivoted to be able to try to redress that. Um, African descendants, right, of slavery have never been paid reparations. The slave owners have been paid reparations, right? So the British taxpayer paid British slave owners reparations. The French forced Haitians to pay reparations to their former slaveholders. And the other portion of their colonies, they did a 50-50. They extracted reparations through a Jim Crow-like construct for newly freed people, and then they subsidize it with a tax, upon their population as well. In the U.S., amendments to the Constitution were written so that the states and the federal government would not be able to pay reparations. It was deemed as a punishment to those folks coming back into the Union, to the slave owners, by the way, right? There is no true conversation about paying reparations to the slaves themselves. One of the things I want to make very, very clear, right, is that the clawback of resources to this white power class was done through the Jim Crow system. Right, it's an effective free labor system. It's draconian, right, and it's enforceable, and it was enforceable upon the pain of death. So the slave owners themselves here received a form of recompense or reparations for it, but Black people themselves have not received reparations. The idea is they saw no need to, right, and they created an ideology and a belief system to substantiate that, right. But the idea that ideology should stand makes no sense.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for that context, for also helping us connect so many dots. It is such a deep and honestly sad story, but I really, really appreciate, and I'm sure so many others that were watching this and listening really appreciate you boiling it down into really succinct bullets for us to understand. We are fortunate to have you for a little bit longer, as well as our previous guest, Mr. Rothstein. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to ask everyone who's watching to hold tight, because what we'd like to do is to transition to the last session of the day. This is about the financial state of Black America. This is a panel discussion with four brilliant minds. Two of them we've already heard from. One I'm going to introduce, who is actually going to moderate this discussion. And I'm also seeing strong Caribbean threads through all of this. So big up to all of my people out there. But I'd like to introduce the audience to Wilson Muscadin. He's the founder of The Money Speak Easy. Spending 14 years in the financial services industry, working with global insurance and asset management firms such as Chubb Insurance and Fidelity Investments, confirmed to Wilson that the financial education gap was wider than his early experiences in college, particularly with millennials. Wilson is passionate about righting that wrong through education, writing, coaching, because he believes that when people have a sound financial foundation, they are much more likely and able to pursue their passions wholeheartedly. He's a Chi-Town native, but currently lives in Chocolate City. He has earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from Illinois Wesleyan University and an MBA from Duke University's Fuqua Business. He's volunteered with organizations such as Junior Achievement, Operation Hope, Capital Good Fund, and the SIFMA Foundation to speak and teach financial literacy across the country. He is moderating our last conversation of the day. And so I'd like to introduce formally Wilson Muscadin.
Yes, sir. Julian, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can see you. We are excited, sir. How are you?
Excellent. I am doing very well, very well. Thank you for that introduction.
Okay, I'm going to fade to black and let you take it from here, sir.
Appreciate you. Again, folks, my name's Wilson Muscadin. I'm a financial coach and founder of the Money Speakeasy. I just want to just take a brief moment just to pause from where we were and the information that we just got from both Richard and Sean. I know for myself personally, when I read both of their books, I had this, I don't know that I quite call it rage, but I was definitely angry in that there are some things that you sort of know in the background, in the back of your mind, that some of these things have happened and occurred, but it wasn't characterized or explained, particularly, Sean, with numbers, with numbers and figures to try to understand the scope of this. And with Richard's book, how he explains that not only it was unjustified, but it was actually unconstitutional in terms of the way that this was implemented, and it was systematic across the US. Sometimes those things can feel really heavy. It's really heavy and it's really big, and then you just kind of get lost in the gravity of it all. But I wanted to have this conversation to sort of bring us together and understand what is going on now and how we can move forward, and some of the things that we need to first understand in terms of acknowledging, and I get both of you guys have done an amazing job of just acknowledging what has happened and helping us to understand and acknowledge what has happened, but also helping us understand how to move forward. So you guys have already seen Sean, have already seen Richard, but I also want to bring to the table Lynette Calfani-Cox. I want to introduce her as well. Lynette Calfani-Cox is important to us all. She is the money coach. She's a personal finance expert, a speaker, and author of over 15 money management books, including the New York Times bestseller, Zero Debt, The Ultimate Guide to Freedom. I just happen to have a copy, a signed copy here. I keep it with me. She's coached all of us on numerous programs, including Oprah, Dr. Phil, The Dr. Oz Show, The Steve Harvey Show, Good Morning America, The Today Show. She's been everywhere. Prior to becoming our money coach, Lynette was also a Wall Street Journal reporter for CNBC. She covered business and personal finance news, and she also worked for the Dow Jones and Company as a reporter, a deputy managing editor, and a personal finance editor. She is a trailblazer in both journalism and personal finance, and a mentor to many of us in the personal finance space. So Lynette, thank you for being here as well. All right. I just want to make sure that I can hear you there, Lynette. Yep, I'm not getting your sound, Lynette. Just if we could just check the sound on your end, Lynette, we'll be right there. All right. Excellent. So actually, that's going to give me a little bit of time because I actually want to share a screen to start us off. I want to share a graphic that I would love to have you guys react to. Let me see if I can just pull this up very quickly. All right. Hopefully you can see my screen. Is that coming clear for everybody?
Yep, I can see it.
Excellent, excellent. I think one of the things that I wanted to start out the discussion with is this visual, because I think it's very emblematic of the discrepancy of between our perception of what's going on in terms of our progress and the reality of some of the data. What you're looking at here, if I can describe this chart quickly, is the median net worth. This is coming from the Brookings Institute, and it's the median net worth by race and ethnicity between 1986 and 1989, and 2016, basically the last 30 years. It's important that it's showing median net worth because the vast wealth distribution of the country, as we discussed. So looking at averages doesn't really help us as much, but looking at median wealth gives us an indication of where the middle of the distribution is. So what the typical white, Black, Hispanic, and other families experienced over the past 30 years. So a few things I'd like to point out of this chart, and then I'd like to turn to the panel, is that you can see the effects of the booms and busts of the economy that have had overall, particularly with white families, but you're not seeing that same effect with Black families overall. So I think if you ask the average person, you know, do you think Black and Hispanic families have made significant financial gains over the past 30 years? I think 90% of us would say, of course, absolutely. But some of the data is belying that. And this data is pre-COVID. So Sean, I want to start with you first and to talk a little bit about what you're seeing here and why the financial wealth gap has basically flatlined for Black Americans, even in periods of great economic expansion, like the 90s and the 2010s.
Yeah, so the framework that I apply is you own about 2%, right, of your wealth today. That's the highest percentage, by the way, that's ever been. If you go back to the beginning of the 60s, right, you're probably at 1%. So it's 100 basis point movement in that period of time within all the change that we're seeing. So when you're coming from a very limited capital base, it makes it very difficult to fully participate in, in real estate, in business expansion, the markets, so on and so forth. It makes it difficult to fully be able to invest in skills augmentation and educational augmentation, because wealthier people invest outside of the educational system in their kids 9 times more, right, than non-wealthy people, to ensure that they're prepared to take advantage of all these kind of things. You're just the most exposed, right? And then your ability to be effectively discriminated against is proportional to the amount of capital that you have. And Black people have the least amount of capital, right, on a per capita basis. So you're exposed in all of these kind of markets and cycles, and it's very difficult, right? And then, you have a greater ability to absorb some of that in the top 5% of families and wealth within the Black community, but the vast majority are unable to participate. So it makes it very difficult, right? Now, it's a little challenging, right? It's also challenging for people who are, Latinos, right? They, in large part, don't have the 400-year history of all of this. And they arrived in very, very large numbers post the 1964 Immigration Act, right? And they're arriving at a time where the country is putting laws and infrastructures in place to effectively redress all the exclusion from Black people. So they and other people, right, and Asians are being able to participate in these programs under this moniker of non-whiteness. So they're able to benefit from those things. They're actually coming in with a stronger capital base that's allowing them to do it. So once you start looking at the underlying infrastructure, you start to see like their per capita income and wealth, even the strength of their financial institutions and industries, it's significantly higher than what Black communities have. So we're hyper exposed, which is why I think you need to have programs that really focus on Black people particularly.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean. I want to go to you, Richard, as well, because a significant portion of this wealth gap that we're talking about was equity in their homes, which you've brilliantly described in your books and your conversations in the movie that you shared with us. Can you tell us how housing plays into this, into what we've seen even just in the last 30 years, and how that's still playing today?
Well, I want to repeat what I said earlier. Let me expand on that a bit. What I said earlier was that the gap between African-American incomes relative to white incomes, which is about a 60% ratio, and African-American wealth relative to white wealth, which varies, but it's always under 10%, typically around 5%. What's that difference attributed to? Well, the difference between, you would think that people could save the same amount of money from similar incomes. So if you have a 60% income gap, you would think you'd have a 60% wealth gap. But the difference in between the 60% income gap and the 5% wealth gap, I think, is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional. I keep on emphasizing that because the unconstitutionality of this system imposes an obligation on the entire country to fix it. It's attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that moved white families into homes that later appreciated in value. Most middle-class families in this country, middle-class, working-class families in this country, get what wealth they have from the equity they have in their homes. That's where they get wealth. So if you're prohibited by public policy from moving to homes which are going to appreciate in value, your wealth is restricted and impeded. I will say that home ownership is not a magic bullet, because typically African Americans who have owned homes, even though their home ownership is much lower than whites, African Americans who've owned homes have owned them in neighborhoods that have appreciated less in value. And if you are helped to buy a home in a community where property values are not appreciating faster than inflation, that doesn't generate any wealth. There are good reasons to promote home ownership besides wealth generation. But the idea that somehow if we move African Americans into homes, home ownership, that they're going to gain wealth as a result is overly simplistic. These days, today, and bring it up to the present time, the only way to gain wealth from home ownership is to buy a home in a neighborhood that's about to gentrify but hasn't yet gentrified. That's the way to gain wealth. And if you're not smart enough, and nobody is, it's like playing the stock market. If you're not smart enough to get into a neighborhood that's going to appreciate faster than all other neighborhoods, you're not going to gain wealth from it. But let me expand a little bit on what I talked about this morning. Why is there a 60% income gap? And there are federal unconstitutional policies behind that as well. Because today, the biggest way to gain wealth from people who own homes is to save. And so if African American incomes are lower than whites, they have less ability to save. Well, why are their incomes lower than whites? Well, there are also unconstitutional policies behind that. As you may know, and as many of your participants today may know, in the New Deal, when the federal government first got involved in labor market policies, occupations in which African Americans predominated were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, from the National Labor Relations Act, which permitted the federal government to authorize unions for collective bargaining rights if they excluded African Americans, and from the Social Security Act. So the income gap itself is partly attributable to unconstitutional policy, not housing policy in this case, but labor market policy. So you put the two things together. An unconstitutional labor market policy, which restricted African Americans to lower paid occupations and then excluded those occupations from coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the minimum wage law, and Social Security, and the National Labor Relations Act's protections. You've got a formula for reducing incomes relative to white incomes. So those two things in combination are what contributes to the wealth gap today, both the inability of African Americans, or the failure due to public policy of African Americans to live in neighborhoods that appreciate in value, number one, and number two, the artificial reduction of incomes due to discriminatory labor market policies that inhibits the ability of African Americans to save. Those two things in combination is what I think is primarily responsible for the wealth gap.
Thank you for that, Richard. I loved how you point out both the labor discrimination as well as the housing discrimination. Lynette, I want to go to you because we've been talking a lot this morning about, or this afternoon, about the macroeconomic policies, what government has done, but there's also the microeconomic kitchen table sort of conversations as well. I'd like you to just weigh in on a little bit of both of them in terms of your experience working in different industries and how that impacts your ability to build wealth, and for those that you've coached and talked to over the years. Oh, I'm still having audio issues, sorry. Sean, let me go to you really quickly while Lynette is picking that up. Can you expound on what you were saying about both about the labor discrimination as well as housing discrimination together, creating these barriers?
Yeah, no, I mean, what Mr. Rothstein said is absolutely correct. So it's the manifestation. So like when I start off the book, right, I start talking about the financial cost of discrimination against Black people that's driven by anti-Black bias that's either conscious or unconscious, and how it manifests itself in discriminatory practices that have a financial effect. So he just talked about two massive unconstitutional discriminatory practices that came from conscious anti-Black bias, right? Which is, by my definition, the Black tax, right? And speaking of how specifically is driving the significant amount of gap that's there. But then you also have the costs that are still happening today on top of all of that was done previously, right? So the issue is how these bias levels are quite high, right? If you start to take a look at work from, Stanford and Chicago and Michigan and AP and others, if they go back to 2012, they put the conscious bias levels at, just over 50%, right? That's 1 in 2 Americans, and this anti-Black bias specifically they're talking about. And they talk about the subconscious or implicit at about 56%, 6 in 10, extraordinarily high by any measure, right? 400 years, into the game. If you look at the work that Harvard is doing, because they have some clever ways of teasing out, unconscious bias through their online implicit association test. Tens of millions of people have taken that test. They're seeing levels of, 70, 75% of those Americans that are demonstrating what they call automatic white preference. Really nice way of saying anti-Black bias, right? So, I mean, these are extraordinary high levels of bias against Black people. And they say that the presence of automatic white preference actually, is predictive of discriminatory behavior, right? And that you can see it in the data. The issue becomes, how does this now manifest itself in ways that create costs for Black people that now resonate and have intergenerational impact? So Mr. Rothstein did brilliant work to explain. I read your book, by the way, it's excellent, right? To explain the history behind it and the unconstitutionality of it, right? It's quite remarkable. And the issue is, how does it keep persisting? Like, I'll give an example. So if we say, if you were Black and you could get a sense of the next community to gentrify, or if you could move into some white communities that have appreciation now, the bias levels play out that it starts to trigger white flight when you start to, your concentration of Black people in that community starts to get to 6% to 10%, right? So now white people start to move, which reduces demand and drives down, prices. You know what I mean? There's a reaction actually to Black presence, and there is an association with crime and low quality in terms of schooling and everything else, even when the attributes are what they want, and even when the actual safety is what they would require, and even when the actual quality of the school system is what they would actually want. The association with Blackness, right, with bias by definition, is systematic error in judgment, right? It's not rational, leads them to want it less, which causes negative pricing pressure, right, on Black assets. And we see that show up in research again and again and again. So part of the issue is when 90% of the market, white people control about 90% of the wealth, has a negative view on your particular assets, your assets are going to be underpriced. I mean, gentrification by definition is kind of the remarking to market of Black property, right? It's undermarked right now because of Black people being present, and then the negative benefits associated with that, right? So anyway, there is a reaction to the presence and perception of Black people that has cost impacts associated with it, right? That still happens, today.
And I want to check with Lynette to see if we can hear you. Lynette, are you with us?
Sure, I am.
Yes, there's a bit of
Oh, good.
of an echo.
Okay.
If you can mute one and talk through the other, that'd be great.
Okay, at least we have audio. And is the video up for you as well?
I do not see you, but I can hear you perfectly,
Okay.
crystal clearly.
We solved one problem and another problem got created. So
That's how it happens.
I'll keep working on the visual.
Please don't let go of the audio. The audio was perfect. There we go. The audio is down. The video.
Okay,
is
here we
up.
go.
There,
You have
that's
it now?
perfect. That's perfect. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Richard, Sean, thank you guys so much, and everybody for the patience. I was waiting eagerly to kind of jump into the conversation here. And Wilson, let me just kind of get in here by talking a little bit about kind of, why we are where we are today. I think that my co-panelists have already done such a great job earlier in this afternoon in their presentations and even in the comments today and talking about a little bit of the history. I want to add to that a concept that, I think was just touched upon a little bit, which is sort of the multiplicative effect of all of this and why it really still matters a lot today. So, those of us who are into like investing, for example, we can get why Albert Einstein talked about compound investing as one of the kind of great wonders of the world, right? And kind of in very powerful ways. And I think in a lot of cases that's what's happened when it comes to Black wealth in America. It's not only economic discrimination in the labor markets. It's not only being disenfranchised at the educational level, which means that some folks will have lower economic prospects when they try to go get a job. It's not only disparities in housing or access to housing or fair lending or being able to be in an area that has properties that appreciate more quickly. It's not only medical disparities where folks who have healthcare issues may have higher cost burdens, may go into bankruptcy more often, et cetera. It's sort of all of these things at a very layered level and compounded generationally, right? So when I think about looking at housing in particular, and I'm so glad that Richard was able to so nicely articulate what happened at the housing level. I hope everybody joining us today got to hear how he talked about Levittown, for example, or just in general throughout America in the 1930s onward, how there were all of these federally mandated policies that said, no, you can't provide mortgages to Black people. No, they cannot move into certain neighborhoods, and how that was codified in ways that exist still to this day, especially when you have institutions like the Federal Reserve Bank itself saying there's mortgage discrimination that goes on right now in 2020. Or when you look at things like the rise of HOAs, homeowners associations, and the ways in which various policies of HOAs or whether taxes in different municipalities and districts serve as barriers to Black folks moving into certain neighborhoods. It's clear that this is a policy issue. It's clear that, as Richard so eloquently noted, it's not just like, oh, we all just made these choices. We just want to live around each other. Every Black person just wants to live around all Black people. And white people just generally want to live around white people. No, it's really the multiplicative effect of systematic, intentional strategies, policies, laws, et cetera, that absolutely need to be undone and that we need to be intentional about undoing. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see the next decade, the next 2 decades, the next 50 years, et cetera, that the gap between white and Black wealth, it won't just be a factor of 5% or 10% or so versus where our white counterparts are. It's going to grow even more, if that even seems possible. We're going to get more into a negative wealth scenario for African Americans and communities of color. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I don't, I guess the main takeaway is that I want people to understand how pernicious it is, how harmful it is when you have all of these things working in concert together in a very layered way, systematically, generationally. The impact and the force of that is extremely daunting. And it's one that's going to take some powerful activism to overcome, to arrest, and to change, to get us on a different course.
Thank you, Lynette. And I love the analogy of the compound interest of these negative policies over generations. I think people can relate to the idea that these different layers of barriers are not only a barrier to those people in those times, but have compounded that effect across generations. And we're obviously still feeling that today. I think with that said, I also want to get to a place where we talk about some of the solutions. Lynette, you talked about the activism, things that need to generally change. What would you like to see in terms of whether it's policies? I think a lot of folks that are that are part of this conversation are feeling a little helpless. What kinds of things can both individuals and us as a society do or think about to try to rectify some of these issues?
Well, I think the main thing is probably the hardest thing. And the main thing is that it has to be everything. And that's going to be a tough pill, I think, for a lot of people in America to swallow, that to address the systemic structural inequality that we've had for centuries in this country, we're going to have to look at every aspect piece by piece and in concert. So it's not enough to just talk about access to higher education or to talk about policy that might go through the government level. We're going to have to talk about governments. We're going to have to talk about corporate America. We're going to talk about the healthcare industry. We're going to have to talk about financial services and access to tools and products and services that help people to generate wealth. We're going to of course, have to talk about housing. It's every single thing, every aspect of society, of our economy, of our nation really needs kind of a rethink to challenge in a very open way and to be intentional about being anti-racist and to be intentional about creating structures that can target specifically Black people. And I, for one, I do have hope and optimism that we're at a very key inflection point in this nation's history, and that the conversation that we're seeing around this whole kind of a racial reckoning, that it is a real and substantive one. But I'm also a Gen Xer who's been around the block once or twice, and I'm not so, I'll say naive as to think that there's not going to be serious pushback. We've been kind of, cooped up, if you will, for about 4 or 5 months dealing with COVID, right? And we see half the country is like, my rights, I want to be out there. I want to get a haircut. I want a tattoo, whatever, right? After 4 or 5 months, they're like, enough of this already, okay? I'm done. Imagine the effort that's going to need to be exerted, which is going to be a multi-year, perhaps a multi-decade effort to right centuries of wrong, and the conversation that's going to have to keep being put forth, the actions, the policies, the putting it in people's face, and people are going to grow weary. They're going to be like, more talk, more help for Black people, really? And so when we talk about reparations, for example, and I'm a person who's a proponent of reparations, do you know how much of a fight it's going to be around reparations? And that's just one little piece of actively trying to make things right. But we have to really gird ourselves. We have to gear up, and policymakers, activists, engaged citizens, financial influencers, everybody at every level needs to be engaged. If you're a healthcare provider, you need to be talking about the ways in which Black people get disenfranchised when they go to the doctor, and how those healthcare disparities, whether it's asthma, like Richard talked about earlier, or whether it's things like being in a neighborhood that's polluted, which means that you have factors that put you more at risk for things like COVID, et cetera. Those folks are going to have to be talking about those issues. Everybody's going to have to do their part, and it's a lot. So I don't think there is one big solution. The thing is that it's everything. It's interwoven into the fabric, the very essence of America, and we have to make this country live up to its promise.
Thank you. Sean, I want you to pick up there, because I think one of the first things that we're doing, and part of the work that you guys all do, is to get us part of that first step. Right? The first step is awareness. We've gone through today talking about some of these issues, and for many of us, it may have been the first time that we were aware that some of these things actually happened. It's almost as if the country is asleep under a different narrative, a narrative that's more about factors like, that it's just about lack of education or character or choices or conspicuous consumption, those kinds of things. But pick up a little bit there in terms of, I know that you talk specifically about some of the programs and things that need to be in place in order to have this dramatic shift, because first we've got to convince the country, essentially, that not only is this in the best interest of the 40 million Black Americans, but it's also in the best interest of the entire country, not from a moral or ethical standpoint, but from a financial standpoint. So can you pick up on that and talk to us a little bit about why this is the right, not just the right thing to do, but the economical thing to do?
Yeah, so it's necessary, right? Part of the conclusion of my talk, I talk about what was the cost to the innovation system by not including the brilliance of Black people who had been systematically and massively disenfranchised under this Jim Crow system in the South, in particular, where the vast majority of Black people were, right? There's an enormous, massive cost to underdeveloping people, and particularly a massive portion of your population. They are going to bear that cost. You're going to bear that cost. It's well-known economic theory that both the discriminator and the discriminated pay a cost for that action of discrimination, right? And it's proportional to the capital difference between the two. So if you're just a pure capitalist, you don't really care about the tree hugging and all that kind of good stuff, discrimination is bad for capital. It costs you money. In the short term, it seems like it's a good idea. It's a better idea for labor. It's a very bad idea for capital. And that's why you see, when you have more so-called diverse teams, you see better performances across industry and so on and so forth. It's a lot of data and conversation about that. That's not just the magic of bringing together different people. That's the power of bringing together the brilliance of people who have been formerly excluded from that population. But you've got to transition in your thinking, because the previous level of thinking was not Gaussian. It wasn't a normal distribution. It was that there was a hyper concentration of everything that was good and wonderful and positive and necessary for driving economic resources in a particular group, and the males in those groups in particular, that is white European. So, and if that's your thinking, then what they did makes, perfect sense, right? That was taught in schools, universities, and all kinds of things associated with that. And it costs a tremendous amount, and we can point to what those costs are. So it's just a raw, clear capitalistic kind of point of view that this is actually good for everyone, right? Being able to invest in people is cliche-ish, but it's also true that the pie is literally bigger, right? The other aspect of it is to talk about when you want to have impact. Well, the first thing is we got to release some of the pressure here, right? And the first thing is you're not trying to boil the ocean, and you don't need to convince everybody. So release yourself of that burden if it's there. Power, authority, the decisions between the allocation of resources is hyper concentrated in the hands of a few. You don't need to convince everyone, right? And you should never ever spend your time with the intransigent, people who are committed to their particular positions, because you're not focused on somebody who's willing to work with you or at least listen to what you're saying. So you don't need everybody. to win. And that's another thing. The other thing is we have to be careful because we've been socialized to want a silver bullet. There is no one thing, right? As Lynette said, that's going to work. It's a compendium of things that are working together in series and in parallel. And it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? People who have been working on these structures have been committed to doing so for centuries. And where we are now, people have been working on for the last 60 years, right? To be able to get to this point, you've got to be as committed to say, I want a longer term plan, right? I'm willing to work on a go forward basis. I think the second thing that's really, really important is you need to have a framework by which you judge the efficacy of what actually occurs, right? The United States, they decided they wanted to create their own country. They created a framework. That framework is called the Constitution. We're going to judge our actions based on this, right? The framework that I came up with is this economic notion of PhD, which is purchase, hire, and deposit, ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital in the Black community. At the end of the day, these policies, programs, strategies that are put in place need to show up in the forms of jobs, business, and capital, right, within the Black community. We have massive gaps across these areas, right, which I've kind of spoken out before. You cannot have the thriving communities that we would all like when you have a gap that's massive in terms of jobs, business, and the associated capital. So when people come up with these great ideas about what they're trying to do, to what extent is actually fulfilling these things? You know, you can, put a program where you make it easier for someone to buy a home. Okay, that's terrific, but you have to be able to afford the home, right? So that's an issue of the type of job that you have that's associated with it. But then the home has to actually be built. All the piece parts have to be made and procured from somebody has to put it together. Who's engaged in all of that process? Typically, Black people are not, and Black firms are not, right? We need to be actively part of that supply chain because that ripples out into the economy as well. Someone has to sell those homes, right? Are realtors engaged in that? Someone has to insure those homes, right? By law or contract. Are brokers insured with that? So there's this PhD notion kind of permeates through all of the participants. And if you're not doing that, you're going to get what I call LIES, low impact economic solutions, right? If you look at opportunity zones and you say, to what extent are they working? How do you define working? For creating jobs, business, and providing capital within those communities. We all know you can do $1 billion project inside of an impoverished community and it'll have no economic benefit for the people in the community. Why is that? They're not part of the construction process, right? They're not part of the hiring process. You're not using your balance sheet to put it in institutions that are providing liquidity, right? Within that particular institution. They're not putting resources into augmenting adult skill sets so they can actually be employed in these industries that are within it. They don't apply a PhD framework. So what you do is existing capital sees a benefit, but it doesn't ripple out to that community and you never change the architecture of it in a meaningful way. So like that framework is really important because it judges the impact and the efficacy of these actions. Then we can start talking about which path makes the most sense, which path gives you the multiplier, which path is the biggest impact, right? And it's most sustainable, but it's got to be within a framework that's driving and filling these gaps.
And that's excellent. And I love your PhD framework and the way that you talk about it. We had a conversation a couple of months ago where the Black Lives Matter was painted on in front of the White House. And right. Your immediate question to me was, well, what types of firms are contracted to paint that? Right? Who
did you hire a Black person to do it? Yeah.
Who was hired to actually do that work? Or you talk about the symbolism has its place, but you're focused and stuck on the economics and the supply chain as you talked about it as part of your PhD framework. And so I very much appreciate that. Mr. Rothstein, Richard, if you will, I wanted to get back to you in terms of in your research and what would you say are some of those policies that you think that are most impactful to deal with some of these intransitive issues? Back to Lynette's point, we know that there's no silver bullet solutions, and it's going to take quite a bit of of convincing of the populace, one, that it's necessary, which is a lot of the work that you do in terms of education, but two, that these policies do benefit the broader populace, and it's important to redress some of that injury. But I'm interested in your take in terms of what are some of the most effective policies that you would like to see in place?
Well, I mentioned a few of them this morning. Permit me to answer your question in a somewhat different way?
Absolutely.
With reference to what both Sean and Lynette have said. You know, Lynette talked about how she's been around the block a couple of times. You look at me, you can see that I've been around the block more times than you can count. And the main lesson I've learned in my life, my long life, is that policy is easy. What's not easy is creating the imperative to implement policy. We just finished many weeks of celebrating the life of John Lewis, who talked about making good trouble. We can talk all we want about policy, unless we're making it uncomfortable with I call a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable for this nation to maintain its segregated boundaries. All the policy ideas in the world won't make any difference. Just as when I was in my 20s in the 1960s, we didn't eliminate segregation in lunch counters and buses and water fountains and swimming pools and employment because we persuaded people it was a good idea. We eliminated it because we made it uncomfortable to maintain those policies. I mentioned before, and I'm sorry to seem like I'm promoting my work, but I do think it will be helpful. I have on Sunday in the New York Times, I have an article coming out, and I'll tell you what it's going to say. It talks about a community, a white segregated community, which was created in the 1940s by a developer, a bank, and a real estate agent on a white real estate agency with government support on a whites only basis. The home sold then for $5,000 and say $100,000 in today's money. They now sell for $1.5 million. There needs to be, in my judgment, a civil rights movement that's going to go to that bank, that real estate agency, that developer, all of which are still in existence today. They're great philanthropists. They contribute money to all kinds of concerts and whatever. They need to be subsidizing African Americans to buy homes in that community that they created as a segregated basis for at affordable prices. The homes now, as I say, go for $1.5 million. That's an easy policy to think about. The government, of course, should be buying up homes in that community for market rates and reselling them to African Americans at affordable prices as an affirmative action program in housing. In my judgment, such a program is constitutionally required. But it's not going to happen unless we make some good trouble in that community. So I want to emphasize that, I admire research. I admire people who develop policy. But the thing that I'm most encouraged about, and I see that there was a question put in the chat room to panelists, the thing I'm most encouraged about is the Black Lives Matter movement and the demonstrations that took place all over the country that could lead, they haven't yet, but could lead to a civil rights movement that will begin to make it uncomfortable not to implement the policies that we well know, like I just said, affirmative action programs for home purchases and segregated neighborhoods, reforming our subsidies for low-income families so that they don't reinforce segregation, things I talked about earlier. Let me make one other point, if I may.
Absolutely.
And I don't in any way mean to minimize what Sean and Lynette talked about the importance of white bias and anti-racist reflection and understanding. I don't mean to minimize that, so don't misinterpret me. That's very important. However, bias is the primary cause of bias is stereotypes based on reality. When whites in the 19th century saw African Americans as slaves, they developed the notion that African Americans were servile. When whites in the 20th century see African Americans living in overcrowded conditions, in places without good city services, in places where, as I mentioned before, pollution, and they developed a stereotype of African Americans as lower class people. Of course, we need to do bias training, anti-bias training, but the best way to eliminate that bias is to create opportunities for African Americans not to live in overcrowded conditions. And when we do that, people's biases will start. I'm not saying it's a total solution, but it's the most effective form of anti-bias training, is to create reality so that people can look at each other as equals. If they're not behaving as equals, if they haven't been given the opportunity to be equals, people can't look at them as equals. So I want to emphasize that, you know, there's a paraphrase of a biblical phrase, you know, you should be known by your actions, not by your words. And I'm interested in seeing people take action to redress segregation. And and that has to come at least as importantly as eliminating bias. Eliminating bias cannot be a precondition, cannot be an excuse for not taking action. We need to take action. Let me make one final point about something that Sean said, and I don't disagree with anything that he said, but you can only have white flight if there are all white places to flee to. And if we had systematic policies that desegregated metropolitan areas, white flight would be reduced.
You know,
I love it.
Wilson,
Go ahead, Lynette. Go ahead.
let me add some thoughts in here, just to pick up on the idea of sort of creating this environment that is uncomfortable for folks to exist in and kind of live and go about their business, and to understand that it's not going to be kind of business as usual. I saw from the chat that someone asked the question about, you know, what about the social unrest that we're seeing and what role does that play in the conversation? So I'll kind of tie the two together here. I do think it's definitely important to cause people to feel, you know, uncomfortable. What happened with George Floyd's murder was definitely one of the most egregious forms of police violence that was put on display, where in the middle of a pandemic, at a time when all Americans across the country were largely at home, right? And people were, you know, had the ability to watch TV, you know, incessantly. People saw for 8 minutes and 46 seconds that a police officer took someone's life casually with his hand in his pocket, despite people saying you're killing him, despite him saying I can't breathe, asking for his mother, etc. And so I do think, and I'm a person who, as a reporter in my past life, I covered the riots in Los Angeles and in the aftermath of the riots. And I saw Los Angeles and the uprising there firsthand, and how people were saying, especially in the Black community, that this was one of the first points of evidence of a videotaped assault, a beating of a man, Rodney King. And people thought, aha, we've got these officers. You know, this is on tape, no question about it, they're gonna be found guilty. Well, they weren't. They were acquitted. And again, a whole bunch of unrest broke out in Los Angeles. Well, now fast forward, you know, 20 something years later, and we see the same type of reaction to police murder of an unarmed Black man. And at this point, though, everybody watched. Certainly a lot of people around the country watched and were uncomfortable with seeing Rodney King get beat, etc. But, you know, there were so many people who said, just like some people said today, what happened before? Maybe he did something. Did he not comply? Was he resisting arrest? On and on and on and on. My point is that even much of white America, and I get it that, like Sean said, we don't have to convince everybody. That's a good reminder for us all. But so much of white America, the Latino community, Native American, Asians, et cetera, have certainly joined with African Americans in saying this is untenable, this cannot stand, this is unconstitutional, this is illegal, this is representative of all of the ways in which Black people in particular are disenfranchised economically, from a social justice standpoint, and literally having our very lives kind of snuffed out. And so the reason I'm raising this issue about George Floyd's death and the civil unrest, besides the fact that somebody asked this in the question here, is that I do think the massive amount of protests that followed the murder of George Floyd, and in fact, the ongoing protests that are happening in a number of cities all across the country, have created and continue to create part of the discomfort that's necessary to get some of these changes that we need. So it's the reason, in part, certainly, that Joe Biden was under pressure to name a Black woman as his vice president. It's the reason, in part, we know Kamala Harris has her own track record to stand on, and a whole bunch of women who were very qualified. But I don't think any of us would deny that the reality is that her candidacy was propelled in part because she's a Black woman, and as a reaction to this environment of saying, in this moment where we need a racial reckoning and where we need some remedies at so many levels, not to mention the fact that Black folks single-handedly resurrected Joe Biden's campaign. That's a whole nother topic, but they're not unrelated, because the same people who are saying, yes, we need to talk about the fact that we haven't had a Black woman on the ticket are the same ones who are saying, yeah, you know what, we need Black women and Black men and people of color on corporate board seats and as limited partners in venture capital firms and as leaders in all aspects of society. And so if you look at, again, whether it's journalism and a place like, say, the Washington Post hiring, I think it was 12 people to cover race in various aspects, race and economics, race and healthcare disparities, race and what's happening at the federal government level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many institutions, many organizations are making changes in part because they're feeling uncomfortable right now. And we need to see that spread throughout our government. We need to spread it throughout the financial services industry. We need to see it spread throughout housing and education. And let me sort of wrap up this part of my comments by talking about two of the main issues that we've talked about in terms of where we see some of these disparities playing out economically for Black folks. We've talked about housing a lot and about education a lot. I want to raise the issue that Black people, perhaps more than any other folks in this country, have bought into this idea of the American dream, right? We are passionate about wanting to become homeowners. We are passionate about wanting to get degrees, to achieve, a bachelor's degree, to earn a master's degree, to pursue higher education, et cetera. You can look at the data around Black women in particular, earning graduate degrees and whatnot. What we don't talk about enough, though, in my opinion, is that part of our pursuit of those two aspects of the American dream, getting that house, for example, getting that college degree, that leads to debt for a lot of Black Americans in particular. And the levels in which we incur debt through our pursuit of higher education or in housing, where if we are able to afford to live in X neighborhood or X, to buy a house of X price, 300,000, 400, 500,000, et cetera, how frequently is it the case that we're able to hang on to that house or to pass it along as a wealth builder, as part of a wealth building kit to the next generation? And I think that we need to talk about, when we're talking about redress and remedies and policies and kind of building up the discomfort, when we're thinking through strategies, we can't just say, okay, yeah, let's make them have higher education. It needs to be some debt forgiveness in here, whether that's for college loans and things of that nature, or whether that's for home ownership, where we know unequivocally that Black people were 2 times more likely to get subprime mortgages than their white counterparts, especially during the Great Recession, during the kind of run-up period where we saw a surge in home prices. Again, Federal Reserve data and elsewhere has shown that Black people who had the same exact credit profile, same income level, same assets, were still more than twice as likely to get saddled with subprime loans. So we can't just say, okay, they're homeowners now and it should be all good, right? They've got a house. Well, no, not if they've got a house with a mortgage that they can't afford, not if they're in a negative equity situation or negative amortization, or if their down payment was only 3% and they really have no equity in the property, right? So when we're starting to think about accessing higher education, accessing home ownership, and the remedies to all of that, of course, we want to provide avenues and pathways to those, but let's not just get people through the door with that and then saddle them with debt. The same thing I think should be the case in terms of a policy standpoint when it comes to business ownership. Yes, we can start and try to give Black business owners capital to access, to be able to start businesses, to fund their businesses, expand or grow their businesses. But look at what just happened when we had the PPP loans that were part of the CARES Act. 500 and something billion went out the door, and literally it was written into the CARES Act, and I read all 800 plus pages of it. It was literally written into the CARES Act under the section that talked about that PPP loan program. It specified that the priority was to be given to minority-owned businesses, to women-owned businesses, et cetera. And that never happened. Like literally in 13 days, the first round, all the money went out the door to larger institutions, some publicly traded companies, et cetera. So even where we had codified in law, in this case, in terms of legislation, here, let's give first dibs on this, these funds for small businesses. Let's direct it towards, people of color, veterans, women, et cetera. It didn't happen. So again, not only do we have to make it uncomfortable for them, when stuff happens like that, we have to hold their feet to the fire and make sure that the enforcement of any policies, any rules, any legislation, that it actually happens as intended. Again, otherwise, like you said, all the policy in the world is really not going to make a difference.
Again, and I thank you for that. And back to Richard's point of the policy being only part of the solution, and that we need to have, there needs to be a impetus, a good trouble, as we will, to make sure that that's implemented correctly. Richard, I want to be super aware of your time. I know that you have a hard stop at 4 o'clock. I want to make sure that if there's anything else that you want to address, you've been so gracious with your time with us, with both the movie and your presentation. I wanted to give you a chance if there was any last messages that you wanted to leave for us before you had to run off.
No, this is a fascinating discussion. I've learned so much from Sean and Lynette in the last hour. I want to thank you both and thank all of you for paying some attention to what I've been saying. And I'm just grateful for this invitation to be with you. Good luck for the remainder of your conference. I hope it's very successful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Richard, if you will. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sean, I want you to pick up from there, because I know that you are focused on if we were to think about reparations, for example, how that would happen. You often speak about the pipeline, the infrastructure, the business infrastructure, and the supply chain that needs to be necessary to even take advantage of something, some sort of financial redress that would be necessary. Could you talk to us a little bit about what is necessary to create the most efficacious redress of a lot of the harms that we've been discussing this afternoon?
Okay, for sure. There's a couple I just want to touch on a couple items that were kind of spoken about just now in the previous segment before Richard had to leave, and then go into that as well, right? One of the things I wanted to reemphasize is that the correction, elimination, removal of bias is not a prerequisite to any motion or movement or plan. It is, the plan should reflect the fact that such bias exists and it imposes massive economic costs to Black people. These biases range from high to extraordinarily high. The data is really clear, right, about it. And the researchers have done the work to normalize for race, which means payment histories, credit rates, balance sheets, profiles, home ownership, all of that has been isolated. The only difference is the manifestation of race through your phenotype, what you look like, what your name sounds like, what your voice sounds like. It triggers these biases, right? So while these things are become internalized through an imposed belief system that one group has on another, they take that belief and they irrationally and incorrectly apply it to members of the other group for which it has no bearing, right? Again, these are people who are applying for loans that are fully capable of paying for those loans at the same rate, according to the same specifics, and yet they're facing 2 times the denial rate, and in some cases 2+ times the cost of capital. That has a deleterious effect because you can't pay for marketing, you can't hire another person, you have less that goes into your retained earnings, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to say, like, it should never be underestimated, the massive cost of bias. The whole purpose of the Black tax is the financial impact of bias. The whole basis behind the observations that are brilliantly laid out by Mr. Rothstein are the manifestations, right, of anti-Black bias. These decisions were made in what statistics called a deterministic way. It was irrelevant of your ability to pay, to participate, to afford. Great Black people, whether it comes to education, whether it comes to housing, whether it comes to loans, have been denied when they were fully 100% capable of it. These are not people that they were trying to push into a realm that they were out of. So I just want to make that 100% clear and kind of double underscore that. The issue here, it was also a comment about, the white flight. I made the comment, and it was also kind of a follow-up comment to it, right? The issue is not physical segregation, right? That is what is projected in all of the conversation and the education, so on and so forth in America. The issue is economic segregation, the segregation of the resources. The reason you have Brown v. Board of Education was because the law said that they could be separate but equal. But they were not equal. The segregation was an economic segregation. They never said that they wanted to go to white schools. They wanted the resources for their schools that they were supposed to get by law, that they were not getting by law, right? What the court found was the most effective way to go about doing it was to have physical segregation, without dealing with the fact that you have massive draconian bias levels within the white population that doesn't want Black people within their community, and they're going to react to it in an often very kind of negative way. The issue of white people leaving a particular community is fundamental, a problem, because they are taking their economics with them. They're taking their intellectual horsepower, they're taking their businesses, they're taking their support services, they're taking the quality of the educational system or the healthcare system, so on and so forth. That is the problem, right? Physical segregation is the most effective way to manifest economic segregation. You are literally seeing that from COVID-19. Sheltering in place is self-imposed segregation across the population. What happened to GDP? Down 30%. Right? That's just basic, kind of economics. Until you deal with the wealth gap, then you have to keep following where the wealth is. And the wealth happens to be with this population because they spent 350 years accumulating it through nefarious ways that we already kind of discussed. And they're able to have more productive environments for human capital development. And their people want to be in those areas, to be part of those environments, because they don't have the internal choice to have those environments across the 12, 13,000, school districts. So that's just a very important point to be made, right? It's the segregation of resources not necessarily of the people. The physical segregation of people is the most effective way to actually manifest economic, segregation. Segregation reduces trade in all contexts. That's why I say it's very, very bad for capital. The second thing is, he is absolutely correct. You got to formulate policy, but you got to get it implemented. And we can do all the talking that we want. Somebody's got to get this policy implemented, and you've got to have a groundswell, a will, right, amongst the political folks and the general population to actually do something. And the Black Lives Matter energy around that is causing that people to pause, to see things in a new light, or to a more of a detail, and to say, what can I do and how do we go about doing it, right? My concern is what you start to see is people start to deploy resources in ways that are not consistent with PhD, right? So you're not seeing the economic effect, you're seeing a symbolic effect. So I want to show you solidarity. So I'm going to make Juneteenth a fully paid holiday. Thank you. For lots of people who've never heard of what that is. You got a $15 billion supply chain. You're spending $41 million a day to keep your people employed. You just put $41 million away ad infinitum, forever, for that particular holiday, so people will spend time with friends, family, shop, barbecue, volunteer, do whatever they want. What I would say is, if that's what you're going to do, and if that's the only thing you're going to do, you take that $41 million and you put that into skills augmentation. You put that into recruiting to get more Black talent, to developing more Black talent, to promoting Black talent. You put that money aside to support businesses, not support, but to augment businesses in your supply chain, so they have access to working capital to be able to meet these larger contracts with you. You put that money aside for business owners who are looking to procure, to buy into your supply chain, right? So they can have acquisition capital. If you don't want to do any of that, then you can take that money and you can put it into financial institutions that provide liquidity within Black communities, whether it's CDFIs, whether it's the credit unions, whether it's Black banks or somebody else who's operating a very focused, specific way that's driving opportunity for Black people. You start to shift away from the symbolism. How did that create a job, business, or provide capital in the Black community? And the answer is it didn't, right? And the other thing that I see is people taking action because of Black pain and deprivation and horrific loss of life on national TV, and directing it to minority initiatives, which is terrific. But when you do that, it winds up being very diluted for Black interests, right? Because the minority numbers, when you get underneath it, you see that the Black participation rates tend to be about 4%, which is exactly the case when you look at all corporate supply chain spend. Within that giant non-white spend, only 4% of it is for Black people. So they're reacting from a specific issue associated with Black people and having very generalized solutions that are dilutive to the issues. And now you have a disconnect because they felt like they did something terrific and they don't realize the dilutive impact. And then when they look around and say, well, where's the benefit, right? For consistent with my actions, right? They don't see the disconnect. And these are the kinds of things that we see again and again and again, which is why you need a framework that's actually specific, right? To help direct this stuff.
One of the other things that happens when you have people just sort of reacting, like you said, to Black pain and to instances that they happen to, be passionate about in the moment, let's say, or to kind of be reactive to, is not only is it kind of diluted in terms of the impact, but it's just not sustainable. It's just something that is kind of more flash in the pan or here today. I was doing an interview the other day with a man from a magazine, and he was asking me about what we're seeing from a fiscal standpoint in terms of consumer behaviors and changes in the way that people are now reacting to COVID-19, this public health crisis that has, of course, now become an economic crisis, layered with the fact that we have a racial crisis that's more heightened and emerged, that has long existed. And he was asking me about what I thought would be permanent, what would stick. And I was really hard pressed to tell him, because we talked about ways in which people, save and spend differently now. But I was sharing with him that at the end of the day, kind of after you get your money, after you earn whatever money you have, really there's only four things you can do with it. You can save it, you can spend it, you can invest it in some way, or you can donate it. You might protect your whatever it is you want to protect, and that's spending it on something to protect yourself. But really, it's kind of boiling down to four core things. And so even the people who are now donating, right, Sean, if you will, for those causes that they think, you know, they might write a check to Black Lives Matter or some other organization thinking they're making an impact, may or may not be diluted, as you just said. I'm more concerned about it being sustainable over time. I'm more concerned about, not that I'm not concerned about it being diluted, certainly, but the fact is, if we just have people reacting with guilt, because a lot of it is sort of triggered by that, and seeing like, oh my gosh, this is a wake-up call for me, right? Things that have been talked about for decades and century, but that I really didn't have full cognizance or awareness of. It never touched me personally. I never fully comprehended, right, the way in which when Black people said, for example, we're getting abused by the police, and people thought it really can't be that bad. And they saw it for themselves and they said, oh, it really is that bad, right? So all of this in a nutshell is kind of like, when we're thinking about solutions and trying to engage allies, and allies is a broad term, because you have to bring people into the fold who look just like you, but who might have a different mindset or orientation. Some people might not be about affirmative action, right? Some people might like being the only one in certain, you know, situations, in certain settings. So, you know, knowing those things, I think that it's incumbent upon us, when we start to think about solutions and strategies, we really have to kind of gravitate towards those that are going to be not only meaningful and impactful, yes, but those that are going to have sustainable, deep-rooted, you know, long-lasting implications, and not kind of be flashes in the pan, right?
Yep.
So, Wilson, I saw you wanted to jump in here. I think maybe with
no. Sean, I want you to pick up on that because and unpack something that you said earlier, because you talked about some of these diversity initiatives and things that we've done in the past, as Lynette mentioned, like affirmative action, that one might not necessarily be sustainable, number one, but number two, are diluted when you talk about the injury to Black Americans. So can you talk about that and unpack that? I know you talked about the lingering 2% or the 4%, but I want you to really explain it for the folks in the back that didn't understand, when we engage in these quote unquote diversity initiatives, why is it not having impact, particularly in the Black community?
Yeah, so every place that I go and I speak to, whether it's Google, Amazon, Viacom, wherever, you know, there's a segment where I talk about, which is diversity, minority, inclusion does not mean Black, right? These are generally euphemisms for not white male. Let me tell you who that encompasses: 90% of people on planet Earth, right? So it's an amazingly non-specific, hyper-generalized group. Now, if you look at the supply chain spend, right, and we go straight to the data, because I'm trying to be quantitative and not qualitative, which is, if you look at, if you say, listen, we want to do more business with women, right, because that's really important to us, and I think it's fantastic. I think you should double, triple, quadruple down on that, right? If you look at how many businesses that have employees, these are the mega businesses within every group, what revenue are they driving? Right? So the ones with women are driving $1.2 trillion a year. If you say, okay, it's fantastic, how much of that is from Black women? It's less than 2%. So as you are driving your initiative for women, it's not until the 99th dollar that a Black woman sees any benefit when it comes from that. And that's what I mean specificity, because I'm interested in how was they elevated and they're not, or marginally being so. If I say the same analysis with our Latino brothers, right, and sisters, and I say, well, we want to do business and drive more business with our Latino brothers and sisters, and I think that's fantastic. Double, triple, quadruple down on that. You know what I mean? Business is great for people. If you say, how many of those businesses that have employees, the larger ones, what's the total revenue that they're driving, right? The last numbers are $380 billion. Okay, fantastic. If you do a down select, you say, how much of that is from Black people within that group? It's less than 2%. Again, it's not until the $99, right? If you invest in that. I'm not telling you don't invest in it. I'm just saying, I'm just showing you what the impact is when it comes to Black people. If you say the same analysis for our Latino brothers, for our Asian brothers and sisters, and those particular businesses with employees, it's $628 billion. There's no Black people in there by definition, right? So if you add up all of that group and you look at the portion of that spend that's going to Black businesses, for that group that's non-white male, it's 4%.
Put another way, just to drive the point home a little further, and I don't have a data point around this, but I just want to use a general observation here. If we talk about things like affirmative action, you were referencing specifically like diversity and inclusion initiatives, et cetera. But I mean, it's still a little shocking to me that most people don't know that people think when they say affirmative action, they're thinking like, oh, it's going to benefit Black people. No, the white women are the vast, majority of recipients or the beneficiaries of affirmative action. So in other words, like Sean was saying about this whole idea, not white males, okay, that's a big category, a whole bunch of people, but in that large subsection, white women are typically, for a host of reasons and in a host of industries and ways, a large part of the beneficiaries, the recipients of those efforts. So I do think it's important to piggyback on what Sean was saying, that we really have to kind of drill down here and look at what the outcomes are. And when you start thinking about the 2% or less, it's sometimes it's discouraging, and sometimes it kind of makes you just want to get up there and just fight so much harder once we recognize how so much work is to be done. I think one of the main takeaways that I'd want people to know as well, especially those who might be watching, who are in positions of power and control, authority, decision-making, et cetera, is I do think part of what Sean's analysis has shown in so many different ways, and certainly Richard as well, his body of work and his research, is how harmful this is to everybody. This isn't just the case that it's hurting or keeping down Black people. No, it's keeping down GDP for the country as a whole. And even on top of that, just literally the idea of innovation being stifled, and the idea that you don't have your best brain power that's being brought to bear on a variety of solutions, new initiatives, products or services that could be launched. It's pretty much like if you said, I'm going into X city, and in this city, I only want the women to come and help me do X, Y, and Z. It's like, oh, you don't want not a single man, even though it's nothing to do with women in particular, nothing sort of gender-based. You're just literally saying, no, I only want the women to help me. And it's like, well, you're missing out on half the population of other brain power, other resources, ideas, creativity, smarts, personal experiences, a whole bunch of resources, intellectual and otherwise, that could be brought to bear on a given, problem or, situation. And so I just think it's incredibly short-sighted. And yes, as Sean has documented, the data is just eminently clear. It's not as if you should have to convince somebody like that this is in your best interest financially. It's like, wow, you're really missing the big picture here if you don't see how clearly, evidently, how massively black and white this issue is from an economic standpoint. You're actually hurting yourself, hurting your business, hurting the employees, your vendors, suppliers, your partners, your folks in your supply chain, the nation, by discrimination and practicing behaviors, policies, things that in on their face are hurting, and people might ostensibly think only hurt communities of color and Black people specifically, but that definitely have this sort of pooling, this widespread impact that weighs down everybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Sean, pick up on that. Give us a final message that you would want to leave with everybody here in terms of one, feeling like what is it that they can do, or at least even think about or take away from the discussions that we've had today. And I know a lot of this stuff is heavy, as we talked about before. but we've outlined the problem. We've talked about a few of the solutions here and how massive of a shift that has to happen to be able to think about redressing these issues. But leave us with some final words of encouragement, if you will. Leave us on a positive note in terms of our ability to be able to make the changes necessary to make some of these things a reality.
Yeah, so I think an important thing is just to put things in context, right? This is the beginning of a journey to be able to move from where we are now to where we need to be. It's what I call terraforming, right? It's changing our environment from one that's unhealthy to one that is healthy. You know, I'm an engineer, I'm a strategist, right? You know, run businesses and all that kind of stuff. It's really important that you understand the nature of the problem and the environment in which the problem exists. People want to fast forward through that and go directly to solutions which are going to be flawed because you haven't built in all the contingencies for the nature of the problem, right? So to spend time really understanding it well for oneself, because the environment is going to react to us. I think Lynette made this point earlier, that there's going to be a response to all of this kind of perceived movement. The reason for that is the very anti-Black bias that I've been talking about, you know, here and also within the book. So your solutions have to kind of build that in. You know, you don't have to have a silver bullet. It doesn't have to be solved tomorrow. This is part of a journey. We got to focus on being informed as opposed to be affirmed, right? Because this country is about affirming your positions, right? It's not necessarily about informing your positions. We've seen that empirically all over the place. So we want to shift away from that, learn as much as possible about the terrain. I'm never daunted by the data because I'm better equipped to. If I know there's lions and tigers and bears and whatever, then I can plan for it. But if I don't know that in my journey, then I can get got, right? The other piece of it is you have to look at things. I strongly encourage people to look at things from a PhD framework, which is purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, business, provide capital in the Black communities, and organize correctly. Those things lead to better health and educational outcomes. Start with what you can do, right? People are at the Economic Development Conference talking about what Black business should be doing and not doing, and they don't do no business with Black business, right? Their money is not in a Black financial institution. The car they drove to get to the vehicle to get there is not from a Black, automotive dealer. There's only 264 of them in America, by the way. Pre-COVID, it was 16,000 dealers. There's 66 jobs per. There's well-paying jobs all the way through. We could create 100,000 jobs just by doing more business with those kind of service providers. You know what I mean? When we have decisions points to make in ourselves, whether it's our realtor, our accountant, our tax person, our financial coach, whoever it is, when possible, where possible, we should use our own balance sheet and P&L to do business with Black enterprise. And I don't use the word support because support is a one-way dynamic, right? The foundation supports you, you don't support the foundation. That's a charitable kind of conversation. What we're doing is commerce, right? So it's what we can do with our own resources and then what we can do within our sphere of influence, right? Whether it's the organizations that we're part of, whether it's the churches that we're part of, whether it's the nonprofit boards that we're sitting on. How are you utilizing your supply chain to do business with Black enterprise? How are you utilizing your balance sheet to put resources in financial institutions that are affecting Black enterprise? What conversations are you having with your alma maters? We're all very proud of these schools that we went to that are multi-billion-dollar economic engines. We focus on how much representation of Black students are there and professors, which is really good, but behind every professor is 10 to 15 jobs behind there that are great paying jobs. Where's the Black representation there? There are multi-billion-dollar supply chains. Where's Black representation there? Right? Like there are opportunities here, right? And making sure that our politicians are aware that PhD matters to us, right? We want to vote for you. We want you to be happy. We want you to be successful. We want you to win, but you got to help us help you. So how are these policies and programs that you're putting in place creating jobs, business, and providing capital in a Black community specifically? Because we can't get to these thriving types of outcomes with gas. It's not possible and it exists nowhere, right? It's not possible in a capitalist society, right? So those things have to reflect it. You know what I mean? We have to let the companies that we work with know that we require and appreciate their actions that are specific and economic and have an impact when it comes from a PhD perspective. If you really want to show solidarity, the most powerful kind of solidarity is economic solidarity. right? So how are they directing actions, through that perspective? For those of us who are blessed to buy a home, I think back in 2015-16, Black people purchased 177,000 homes. I think that was the number. If which is below what it should be. But if those people had utilized a Black realtor, you'd need 14,000 more realtors working every day, all day, every waking moment, just trying to close all those transactions. Our realtors aren't getting a look. All those things need to be insured, right? When you start thinking about, oh, we want to do a public housing program. Okay, great. Low income housing. That's fantastic. I'm sorry, who's building it? Who's designing it? Who's contracting it? Who's putting in the roofing and the Cat 5 cable and the plumbing and the HVAC and all that kind of stuff? You're not going to give it away. Who's selling it? Who's insuring it? There's tremendous opportunity that we can do and our allies can do that doesn't require any government intervention and doesn't require anybody's permission. So the things that are available to us that we are really leaving on the table, we should do and execute those things now. They can actually have a significant impact. It's not a cure-all, but it's something that's within our control. And then we've got to start requiring our leaders and our advocates, right, and our politicians to put programs in place that execute PhDs. I've looked at these presidential programs, right, and I've worked with some of their teams. Some of these folks are well-meaning, but PhD isn't built into it, right? And because it's not, and I'm not saying they're being nefarious in any way, they're just not thinking in that way, you lose the multiplier effect, right? $1 billion investment can have a $6 billion impact as it reverberates out through the community's primary and secondary and tertiary impacts. If you read these programs that they put in place and you apply a PhD lens, it becomes very clear and very depersonalized. Right? The people are great people and they're wonderful family people and their neighbors love them. And that's great. How is it driving jobs, business, and capital in a Black community specifically? And you or this person or me as a leader, how are you driving PhD, right? When possible, where possible. You can't always do it because of all the trauma that we've gone through, right? But we can utilize our service providers, and we have many that are incredible and extraordinary, and they are ready now, and they are hyper underutilized, right? When these people go and they do some big transaction that we're all excited about it, what advisors did they use? They're paying $18 million in fees. How's that flowing into that person? Because that now hits not only a family, but that hits a place of worship that they may be a part of. That hits the nonprofit boards that many of us sit on top of, right? Or sit as part of, and reverberates throughout the community. So these are the things that I say. I'll give a quick final example. I remember I was asked to speak at a conference called a Green Conference about taking advantage of kind of the marijuana revolution, right? And the challenges associated with it, the capital hurdles, right, that people have. And these big giant firms are well positioned and they're kind of taking over everything and they're crowding out Black presence in there. And Black presence has to be in there. And one of the things I was saying is while you fight that effect, also require that those firms do PhD. PhD says, take me with you. Right? Because now I have to be in your supply chain and we have to be properly represented over the fullness of your supply. The vast majority of spend in a business is on the procurement of products, the transformation of those into sellable products, and then the selling of them. All that's people. That's the vast majority of the resources. And PhD makes sure that we're filtered across the fullness of that spectrum. So that's what I would say in a short period of time.
Absolutely, Sean. And thank you for that, because I think what we can take away, if I'm going to take away something for what our next steps are, what we need to think about, or how we think about moving forward, it goes to your quote, and you said it over and over again, from an economic standpoint, focus on the supply chain. You said, the question is, how are you driving jobs, businesses, and capital in the Black community? If we're asking that question of ourselves personally, in our spheres of influence, I know that is definitely an impactful way to think about how we are moving forward. If we continually ask that question and make good trouble asking others that question, I think that is definitely a way to drive us forward. So I want to thank you all, Lynette, Sean, Richard as well, for this amazing conversation and this amazing day. You guys have opened so many eyes with the conversations you have and the work and the careers that you guys have had. You guys are personal heroes of mine. So I want to thank you for that. And thank you for your time. As well, I'm going to bring back Julian to close us out for the day, but I want to thank you again for your participation, and hopefully if there are more questions, we'll go to we'll talk about the second day and the third day of the conference as well. So I'm going to turn over to you, Julian. Thank you so much.
Wilson, Lynette, Sean, and Richard, who's no longer here. Thank you so much, guys. One of the worst things you can be as a host is speechless. And I'm almost there. I'm not quite speechless. but I do have a few words. I'm impressed. I'm starstruck a little bit. But I think most importantly, and I think a lot of people, my DMs have been blowing up during this entire day, is that this is an incredibly powerful day. And I think what's even most important is, particularly given all that's going on, I think we've left people quite hopeful. And I think not because we have learned more about the history of our country and even where we are today, but I think that a lot of the viewers out there are confident that the people that are a part of this community and that are leading this community and leading this work are incredibly equipped to do so. And so when you see all of us in the same room at the same time, you see superheroes and super sheroes really leaning into their strengths and using our collective power to drive change and to drive awareness. I think it's leaving a lot of people, myself included, incredibly hopeful. And if there was one person that we would have to really thank for bringing all of this and all of us together, it is the one and only Sandy Smith. And so I'm going to pass it to her to leave some closing remarks. Thank you all for being patient with us, for being flexible, from bouncing around from place to place, for dealing with all of the technical difficulties. We appreciate it. And I'm going to pass it off to Sandy to take us home.
I think my next job is in tech support because what a day today has been. So I have a couple of just final things. First, I have to thank Julian for being an affable host the entire day. I asked Julian to be the host today specifically because he has this demeanor and he's calm and cool and like, Julian, this is going to be a crazy day. I don't know, things might not work. And he definitely works with me through this entire process when we had some glitches with technology. You know, it is what it is. So I'm glad that you guys stuck around for all of that and that Julian filled the gaps and the spaces and was a great host. So, you know, thank you, Julian. I couldn't have asked for any more than you already gave. I also have to thank and acknowledge the Motley Fool. Without their support, this day would not have been open to so many people. We had over 4,300 people register for this event today. If I can tell you, my phone has been on fire. I'm literally surrounded by computers. There's a computer over here, there's one here, and there's one here, and my phone. And a lot of people were on this event, much more than we had originally planned for. And that would not have been possible without the folks at the Motley Fool. So I want to thank them very much for sponsoring this day and taking a leap on us having these very serious conversations. They're not easy, but bringing them to the forefront so that we can all participate in these conversations together. I've seen a lot of your comments and you guys have, some things really surprised a lot of people. My Twitter is on fire. Continue to share the gems that you picked up today. Be sure to hashtag Elevate Influencer and hashtag On Color and Money. And if you want to tag the Motley Fool, that's great as well. It is not easy for a company to really go out on a limb with an event kind of like this. We're only in our second year, in these conversations that we have that were very important and very, very strong conversations with all the people that we had here. I want to thank all of the people who came to this event. Many people volunteered their time and their expertise. Richard Rothstein, Sean Rochester, Lynette Kalfani Cox, Wilson, Julian, of course, Tiffany, and Harlan, I could not have asked for better thought leaders within this space to join us today to share their knowledge with us. And I am richly blessed by the friends that I have and for my ability to beg people to come places and email, an email form, and for them to show up. So last few housekeeping things. There is a contest that you guys have been participating in. If you had downloaded the Whova app today, you have the ability to win a $100 Amazon gift card. So I would like to acknowledge Adrienne Cruz, who has been burning up the conference app today. She is the winner of the $100 Amazon gift card, and we will get that out to you. Thank you, Adrienne, for being so engaged and for participating this whole entire day. I think Adrienne didn't go to sleep. She's been participating since yesterday. And also I want to thank the event leaders, Olivia, Athena, and Crystal, who led an icebreaker earlier this morning before the event even started. We've all been home for a couple of months, and they all led scavenger hunts at home. Yes, toilet paper was included. So they led those scavenger hunts earlier today. I want to thank them. And then beyond me, there's a team of people who keep this all going. And they're very hidden, but I want to acknowledge Khalif and Sherry Ann Crumbly and Tamika Edwards, who is my right hand, who has kept this all going. Wilson, who coordinated every single one of the speakers for us so that we could have everyone here, could not have happened without their help. So people see me as the face of this conference, and me the face of this conference, but there's a whole team of people who have been working on this for months to bring this to you and bring these conversations to you. Now, this day is ending right now. It is a free day open to the public. I hope that you guys learned something. I would encourage you guys to pick up the books from Sean Rochester, The Black Tax. You want to pick that up, super informative. And also Richard Rochester, The Color of Law. Those two books will carry you a very long way and will motivate you a lot into doing things. The conference does continue tomorrow and the day after. Those days are premium days. A lot of what Sean talked about is being able to build our own businesses and spend your money intentionally. So tomorrow we're being very intentional on helping mostly businesses of color build their businesses the right way. And we're focusing primarily on finance-related businesses because this is a finance conference, and it's usually closed to individuals within the personal finance community, but we open it to you guys. So tomorrow we focus on building our businesses, and on day 3 we focus on the community. So if you have one of those premium tickets, I want to encourage you to come back. The tech will be easier. And we will meet another host tomorrow who will be hosting the day tomorrow. Final words, Julian. I couldn't have done today without you. I really want to thank you for everything that you've done today. Cool and calm and collected, even when you guys don't see him on the screen in the back end here as we're chatting. And as things are breaking down, he was Mr. Cool the entire time. And I really have to thank Julian for everything that he has done and all of you guys who have attended. Any final words from you, Julian, before I shut us off with some inspirational words from one person I think you guys are going to like?
It's 5 o'clock somewhere. That's the only thing I have to say.
All right, so I want to close you guys off with some words that I found inspirational that has been guiding me for a long time. They are the words from President Barack Hussein Obama. And his words are, money is not the only answer, but it does make a difference. Use your money to make a difference. Thanks, guys.